Catherine Barton has been excused from the meeting, but we do indeed have a quorum, and we're going forward. We have approval of 4 different minutes.
Is your microphone on?
It is, yeah.
Okay.
And sure, do we have to approve these separately or each of them?
You can approve them all at once if you want. That's fine.
The approval of the minutes on the agenda, the August 10th, 2015 regular meeting, and then 3 joint Utilities Finance Commission meetings on October 5th, October 12th, and October 16th. The pages are in the neighborhood of, here are the minutes, so they are rather extensive. I'd like to entertain a motion, unless there's some discussion for any changes or deletions, make a motion to approve all of them.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
I do not see any public comment, but for the record, Randy Auld has an appointee who was not yet appointed, and I would like Randy to come to the podium, introduce his prospective appointee, and perhaps let Nathan come up and just say a few words about himself.
Fine. Nathan Plakwich has gracefully approved to go on the commission, and I hope you say nothing discouraging to him today, because I'd like him to join next week. What I think we both decided that maybe we'd hold it off till the next meeting so he could get a chance to talk to you before the sunshine laws get into effect, and get a bit of a background. He's seen the coffer from last year, and then it's got the budgets, and he's jumped into it and understands pretty well what's going on. So let me get him to say a word or two.
Just for the record, Nathan, your address, please.
515 Iris Lane, Vero Beach. Yeah. So I'm Nathan Plakwich, work for Professional Advisory Services. I'm an investment analyst. I hold the Chartered Financial Analyst designation. So I have a pretty broad background in finance. I've looked over the books. They're a little bit different than looking at a corporation's financials. But I think it's relatable. So hopefully I can add something positive over the next year, and look forward to working with you guys. Right.
Well, thank you, and just we've always had a very cordial and productive relationship with Jim and Cindy and the entire staff, and so feel free to, on an ongoing basis, any questions, and of course, up until the time sunshine kicks in, we can have a dialogue with any of us, and invite you to give a call should you have any questions.
Yeah, I'm sure I will. So.
You can talk with us anytime. We're not.
Okay.
Communication's not governed by the sunshine law, so anytime you need.
Okay, great. All right, thank you.
Welcome aboard.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nathan. With that, we can have a potentially engaging meeting, but we've been asked to be respectful of Ted Fletcher's times and commitments to change the finance director's matters of having the cost analysis savings resulting from closure of the city electric power plant from item D to the first item. So with that, if we can proceed with a motion to...
So moved. To move substitute D for A. Is that what you want to do?
No, put D in front of A, and then
Yeah.
go to A, B, and C.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay.
I'll second that.
All in favor? All right. With that,
What you have in front of you for this agenda item is an analysis of the operating cost savings from closure of the power plant. And what I want to clarify is what it is and what it isn't. When you met jointly with the Utilities Commission to talk about the new OUC purchase power agreement, this financial analysis, the savings resulting from the closure of the plant, both in 15-16, the current fiscal year, and then in 16-17 and forward, once it was completely closed, this analysis was incorporated into the data that Mr. Wright and Mr. Harrington provided you. So when you saw this briefing that included, for instance, a projection of new residential rates going forward, the savings from the closure of the plant were part of that analysis and were part of these rates going forward after the OUC PPA was amended. So it's really a subset of the data that you've already seen. What I've attached for you are documents that show by department just the 15-16, the partial year savings. Clearly going forward from there, once it's completely shut down, there would be full savings and residual costs of about $832,000 every year, and we'll get into that in a moment. The analysis that we originally did for Mr. Wright and Mr. Harrington's presentation assumed that there would be a partial shutdown on December 1st of 2015, and then the final unit would shut down on July 1st of next year. And that analysis included us making provisions for paying out accumulated leave and sick and vacation balances to those employees who would be eligible at termination, accounting for those residual fixed costs associated with pension liabilities and employees that might be retained within the electric utility in future fiscal years, the elimination of the capital and the repair and maintenance expenditures going forward for the operating side of that and those transfers. But it was definitely for a partial fiscal year, and now that we have been able, it appears, to accelerate that shutdown schedule, it won't be different, it will be sooner. So rather than it being into July of next year and then October 1st for the full savings, it's likely to be sooner that we'll realize the full savings from the complete shutdown. We're in the process of reviving our completion of our rate study that we started and that we talked about back in the spring that we put to the side while we were trying to resolve what to do with the OUC PPA. And so essentially, as Ted and the rest of us go through the regulatory approvals and the personnel actions that are necessary to actually shut down the plant, those real costs will be incorporated into the completion of the rate study. And at the end of the day, if anything, us realizing a rate impact from those savings will just happen sooner than it would have if it was July 1st when we shut this down. So with that, I'm happy to talk about the data and the analysis inherent here in what we've taken into account in shutting down the plant. But also, it's important to keep in mind that these were annual operating cost savings, transfers to R&M, personnel, ongoing insurance, ongoing costs. That is a completely different topic than the one that Ted is prepared to talk to you about, which is, what about shutting down the plant? What are our options, and what are the one-time costs and one-time revenues from things like sales of surplus that we have to consider as we shut down the plant and as we move toward a decision about what to do with that site in the future? And so those are really two separate things. This is the ongoing operating costs that affect the rate, and it may be sooner than we thought, but it won't really be different. And the second topic, which Ted is prepared to address, which is, okay, now we've shut down the plant, what do we do and what will it cost us, and what are the one-time revenues from surplus sales and things like that we can realize to offset the costs of the actual shutting down and dismantling of the plant. So with that, I can answer questions about this, or if you'd like, Ted can go through his presentation about, now that we've shut it down, what do we do?
what is the pleasure of the commissioners, to listen to Ted or to any questions you want to pose now?
I think we should go ahead. Cindy, I'm glad you clarified it, because in the last meeting we had, public meeting, it was a little unclear that those operating, I thought they were too. All closing costs were incorporated in the figures. So our projected revenue and expenses going forward in 16 are going to be what we told the people on the budget. We're not going to be any surprises on that.
Well, the budget was actually for operating everything for
I'm
a
talking
full
about
year. So that'll be-
utility savings.
Right.
Yeah.
The numbers that we're
all-
talking about were part of this presentation
That's
that
what
Jeff
I
gave
thought,
to you.
too.
You're
Yeah.
absolutely right. You're
Right, 'cause
absolutely
it was
right.
a little confusing there at public meeting. I thought, no, it's all included. Okay.
Well, with that, I concur. Unless there's any other comments, Ted, you meld into what City has just presented, and then at the end we will ask any questions that come to mind. So, please.
Very good.
I just have one comment that I also sat through and made some comments at the extensive Utility Commission meeting, which covered these same subjects. So I have had some background, and it was helpful that as a result of that meeting, there were several items that were brought up for clarification, which I understand both Cindy and Ted have incorporated. So, Ted, go ahead.
Okay, this presentation is, I changed a couple items on it that we discussed at Tuesday's meeting. We changed just some verbiage to phases, and the pictures kind of show a little bit more green space that was wanted to be addressed. So what are the possible phases available after shutting down the generating units? Phase 1, keep all transmission and distribution facilities within the building, and there was some confusion on that, so I'll address that when we get to it. Phase 2, construct a new control house on existing site and proceed with the demolition of the building. Phase 3, relocate all transmission and distribution facilities to another site. So here's Phase 1, where we talk about leaving all of the transmission and distribution facilities within the building, and all that green space where we talked about removing the cooling tower and all the outside facility buildings. So this Phase 1 here, you see the 13 kV, and there was discussion about, well, they didn't understand what was still in the building. You see where I'm showing the 13 kV. That goes inside the building, and it's connected to the 13 kV switchgear and all the DC circuitry, everything. So that's why that has to remain for the building to be there, as so is the 69 ring bus that goes into the building. So Phase 1, keep all transmission and distribution facilities within the building. And this is where we start the process to sell all available assets, such as generating using turbines, pumps, motors, etc. That estimated value was about $800,000. Remove all the hazardous chemicals, cooling tower on the riverfront, as I discussed, and all the oil and tank and lines. Close out all EPA and DEP permits. Phase 2, this shows the building being gone and the control house where you see the point to. That's kind of what that area would look like. The new control house is approximately 30 by 70, and that would be able to accommodate all of the transmission and distribution facilities that are inside the building. That estimated cost of $3.5 million. Here we would start the process to sell all assets, estimated value of $1 to $1.2 million. And then at that point, we would start demolition of the building, outside support facilities, estimated cost of $9.9. And I discussed this Tuesday also. That cost could be a $5 million, and the top end, it could be a $9.9. It just depends what we run into as far as any environmental impacts inside.
And that's in addition to the net of the estimated cost of 3.5 less than 1.2 mil in monetizing assets. So now you're talking potentially up to $12 million to go to Phase 2.
Wasn't that a savings of 0.8 and then 3.5 and a savings of 1.2? So we got a net
Well, because you have
1.5 plus the 9 million.
Well, I think that
I'm not sure how that's.
Yeah, I'll ask Ted, but I believe the 1.2 in the first phase was 800,000.
Right.
That's correct.
And now under Phase 2 would be 1.2 million.
But it's not 2 million total, correct? It's
$2
either
million total,
800,000
right?
or
Yeah.
1.2.
That's
So
what I
then
thought.
it's-
The only reason that you see this 1.2, and I discussed this with Lloyd, the Power Services, they did the study on the report. The 1.2 is because you have the whole building, okay? All the assets inside the whole building, whereas on phase one, you did not have the whole building. There were still components that had to be intact for all your transmission and distribution. Does that make sense
Yeah,
to you?
but what
So
I'm saying,
essentially, you'll get if we do phase one, which is the current plan, you'll have about $800,000 in sales of assets. Then when you move to essentially your decision between phase two and phase three, you'll have another $400,000 worth of assets available to sell.
Yeah, but what-
It's not 800, then another 1.2. It's 800 in the first round and another 400,000 coming up to
so
1.2. Yeah.
1.2 is cumulative.
That'll be once you go to get rid of the building, that 400 grand will be the rest of the
Right.
things you have available to sell as you
I
demolish
just
the
wanted to
building.
clarify that, too.
yeah, and where I was coming from is at 9.9 million for the outside support and demolition, plus the building of the control house of 3.5 million, then offset by what we just talked about in terms of savings.
The 800 plus the 400, correct.
Yeah.
Ted, let me ask you a question.
Yes, sir.
Because I thought I understood it, and now I'm not sure I do. The 9.9 million includes the 3.5 million for the construction of the 30 by 70?
No, it does not.
So
No, the 3.5 is the cost for the control house and then to remove everything outside.
Why do we need that control house?
It's
Eventually, are we going to be permanently transmitting electricity or electric power from it?
It's basically going to be a substation because where your ring bus is currently now, all of that is just like a substation that I currently had on the other slide, but it has all of your facilities with your transmission and distribution that are inside the building. You build a control house to take everything from inside the building, your SCADA points, your DC circuitry, connect to your transmission ring bus and all your distribution switchgear, and that's where you have a substation.
Could we use the existing building right now for a control house and not demolish all of it?
And that's what kind of phase one says that we would do.
Right now, it is all inside the existing building. So
Right.
I think what we're saying is with phase one, we wouldn't demolish the building. We'd leave it standing so that it could provide cover for those assets. And we would get rid of everything else, the cooling tower and the tanks and stuff in the back. And really, I mean, this is what clarified it for me during the conversation the other day. Phase one is sort of like the beginning thing to do, but phase 2 versus 3 is really a decision point. Then you have to decide, do you want this new control facility to be on the site or somewhere else? And when he gets to phase 3, I think that'll be more clear. So phase 1 is really the simplest version of shutdown. Shut it down, leave the building intact, remove everything that you can remove, and then make a decision.
Could you?
Phase two, phase 2 could interfere with the long-term planning of that site.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
And this is where phase
For a
3
change,
comes
makes
in.
it right. That's like-
And that's where his phase 3 comes in when he talks about that.
Okay.
Well, we can discuss this later, but you have to wonder, where's the $9.9 million going to come from? To
Rates.
demolish the building?
Rates.
Okay, phase 3 here, we talk about, this is if you're going to relocate all the transmission and facilities to another site, whether if that's across the street or wherever your direction is to move it. So acquire a new site for construction, relocation of transmission distribution facilities, keep it in close proximity of the existing site, and keep in mind, the further you go away from your current site, the more that drives up the cost. Estimated cost for a new substation site is approximately $8 million, pending the location. At this point, location is unknown. The one on 18th that we were talking with FP&L years ago, that site is no longer available.
Ted,
Ted, is that the land cost you just threw out there, $8 million? Or is that the relocation cost plus the land cost?
That's not the land cost. That's just basically the substation.
Oh, that's the cost of the sub, without any land considered.
And that number was derived from going to the post office annex years ago, or the one on 18th Street, I'm sorry.
But that 8 million doesn't include land,
Right, doesn't.
and it doesn't include building a new control.
No,
No, that 8
It's
million
includes
is
control,
a whole
yeah.
new control house.
It
with all your
doesn't. It doesn't
Yes, sir.
include the control house and the.
Yes. That's everything for a substation.
I think if I understand this correctly, that $8 million is apples to apples with the 3.5 to build a new control house on the current site. In other words, it costs you 3.5 if you put a new control house on the
Right.
current site and demolish the building, and 8 if you move it to a different site and demolish the building.
But it doesn't include the cost of land unless we use city land.
Correct.
Okay.
Ted, let me ask you a question. Back in phase 2, you had a figure from 5.5 to 9.9 million to demolish the building, and you had a price for constructing the 30 by 70 at 3.5 million.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
What would be the difference between building a 30 by 70 on the existing site or moving it to that southwest corner where the old annex used to be and putting it in for 8 million? What's
the difference? Is that where you? Okay, the difference is because you have all of your ring bus, your 69 ring bus, already intact, so we can utilize that without having to purchase all new breakers, all new ring bus, and everything else.
Okay, so now the ring bus would stay right where it's at?
That's correct.
Right on Indian River Drive there?
That's
Boulevard?
correct.
Yeah. Okay. So that would play into future uses of that property there. And that's the only reason I'm asking that question, is whether you leave that facility where it currently is or move it to another facility that may not be as desirable as riverfront property is.
Right.
So that's the reason I was trying to get a clarification. So you would need to move the ring buses and build the building, and all of that's included in the $8 million.
Yes, sir. Everything you see on that property right now would all have to be relocated. All your 69, all your distribution, and everything, all
And
your
it's-
fiber optics, everything that's currently in there.
But,
As the moving commercial used to say, it's the same price whether it's across the street or across the county.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
But I want to make a point, is that it's almost a fork in the road. Do you do 2 or do you do 3? When you talk about the 8.8 million, that doesn't include the land. It does not include the demolition of the plant, does it?
No, sir.
So you're not talking 8.8 million.
this is a $20 million term.
Yeah.
But again, the real difference between the two things, the demolition of the building is, let's use the 9.9. That's the case either way. So the real difference is the 3.5 versus the 8, and then the question of city-owned property that we don't have to pay for, or a site that we have to buy. So
Yeah,
I mean, the
because-
real difference is about $4.5 million plus land if we don't use our own.
Because you're going to pay the demolition regardless.
Either
And
way.
No,
depending-
not under phase 1 if you don't go to phase 2 or phase 3.
Oh, if we do phase
Well,
1 and never do anything else, then
that's
it
right.
sits right there. But I think we're all thinking the likelihood of that is
I
probably.
thought we were talking phase 2 versus
Smaller.
phase 3. And the reason that price has such a difference is because you're not sure of any kind of mediation or mitigation that needs to take place on that property. Is that correct?
On the
Because that
exist-
could enter into the cost significantly.
Right.
Okay.
No, I thought,
Just for clarification here, we're talking about a demolition and the materials inside the building. We're not talking about taking a slab up and doing environmental remediation that way, if there was required. There's no indication we have any environmental issues on the site, but once you start disturbing that, so that 5.2 to 9.9 is just demolition of the building, any asbestos and any debris inside the building that would have to be handled.
Okay, no subterranean, nothing
That is-
in the dirt.
That is correct.
Okay.
And if you talk about the phases that we're doing here, if we decide that we want to go to phase 3, and for some reason somebody wins the lottery and says, let's do that, then you would have to determine the type of land use you would want for that site, and that determines the amount of the type of cleanup that you would have. And obviously, the higher the dense, for example, residential, the cleanup could be obviously more expensive. Fort Pierce is experiencing this. A lot of our numbers came from Fort Pierce and the people that are doing our optimization study said even if we went in here and cleaned up the site, went to phase 3, and let's say we got off easy and had the highest and best use of the land, we would still be, was it $5 million we'd be in the hole?
$5 million after you sold and then constructed everything,
Yeah.
correct?
That is, assuming you could get the highest and best and you get a good dollar value for the property.
Jim, clarify, we'd be $5 million in the hole, what do you, is that
That is, if you got market value for the property
for the land at some, it's,
at a highest and best use, that is,
okay,
you
the
put out
highest
an
and best use
RFP.
for the waterfront land,
Yeah, and you sold it at what was
Right.
determined as market value,
less the,
and then you take the demolition of the building
plus
and
the,
clean up to the,
and we're still $5 million in the hole.
we're still $5 million in the hole.
Holy moly.
And
Yeah.
that's assuming that we clean up and have the exposure that we think we have, which is very little.
Okay, and is it possible, given the environment inside the building, that the building could be used as some other places have used them?
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, if you were just going to clean out the building, now the problem is you leave the building there, we're still going to have our substation attached to it, so
Right.
it's very limited use as to what you could do with the building, because the DC and all those switchgear and all that kind of stuff would be still in the building.
Yeah, it's
So
not
you couldn't just
concentrated.
lease it out for office space or anything.
Tough to do, yeah.
But Jim, if, so that I am clear on it, if we build a control house and we demolish the existing building down to the slab, do nothing else there, then that demolition cost is somewhere in that 5.5 to 9.9 range.
That is correct.
Okay.
Plus
And
the
that
construction.
and that slab could be, if as long as it's not disturbed, it wouldn't require, unless the different land use came into play,
That
it would not require anything additional.
That is correct. We have 2 points of reference on that. One is what is Fort Pierce is experiencing. They have about 11 million into theirs, but they took a very high dense type of use. They wanted single family. They turned the property over to the CRA, and they had a lot of plans. And so their costs have escalated because of that. The other thing is when we talk about leaving the slab, example would be our diesel plant. And I met with both our environmental advisor as well as the state representative from Brevard County talking about these type of facilities. And as he said, that encapsulating, as long as you have no plume leaving the grounds, that you can capture that, the use that you put on top of that is really insignificant to them. But
Yeah, you've still got sewer line problems and water problems and everything else going on under the slab.
That is correct.
Irrespective, unless you build a subfloor over the top.
If you build the subfloor.
You can build a subfloor over it.
And Glenn, when we first got into this thing and talking with Florida Power and Light, when they're in the contract, they take the building down for us. One of the concepts that we discussed is taking it to the slab, putting 6 or 8 inches of dirt over the slab,
Right.
and then that just becomes a green space.
Right.
And then you can use it for as
You
in the
capitalize
charter.
it as it is. And
That's correct.
Don't take it out. You don't have a use for the land at all at that point.
Well, you could theoretically put a building on there and put pilings if necessary.
No, I understand.
And do that. And then that would be just a risk of where those pilings went in. But again, if you can encapsulate and not have any leakage off of the site, and it's a type of environmental pollution that is controllable, then you would not have any real issues.
And the two issues that you said were the ultimate use of that land. If it's going to be a park or a green space, then there is no revenues being produced. That has to be a determination of the, I presume, a referendum in order to sell that riverfront land, and whatever the voters come up with is the direction for the future. So that's one issue in terms of what the best use would be, and then that being determined, have a referendum to see what, and then reprice all these costs because you're getting no revenues from the land. If it is a recreation or park, which is only going to cost more because you have to put park facilities in, you have to maintain it if it is to be a park. So there are a number of hurdles and issues and in front of us. But the bottom line is going forward with phase one, implement that, and as discussed, once that occurs, see how it feeds into any with an accelerated, perhaps, timeline, what impact energize the rate study that Cindy was speaking to, and see where we are.
Also, just as a note, just so everyone knows, we do have a couple of committees that are out working on potential land uses of this site. There'll be another public meeting on November the 30th, as I understand. The chairman of the Recreation Commission is sort of heading it up, but the Marine Commission's involved in those discussions. Also, the Chamber of Commerce has been contacted to ask their people to give some input as to what potential uses for that site would be, with them understanding the limitations of what we're under the charter and potential environmental. So there's a lot of people looking at the site, and when we start talking about phase one, phase two, and phase three, it's sort of like when Ted and I talked and he was putting this together, and we looked at options 1, 2, and 3 as the way it was presented to the Utility Commission. They're the one that sort of incentivized and said that, maybe it should be phases, because that's really what it will be. The assumption is what is your end product? Is it going to be the total green space that Ted showed you, or could we tolerate a substation on the site? And that's where you come to that why. But at the same time, you could go and build that substation with the understanding it may be 15, 20 years down the road, and you depreciate that cost. It's not a bad investment.
And Jim, that's absolutely right. I have the opportunity to sit on the Chamber Task Force, and we've looked at several different options, and some are generate no revenue for the city, but the property remains in the city, remains with the public in the city and the county for use. But also the potential leaseback of leased facilities. So, just because it's a green space in one aspect of it doesn't mean that there won't be absolutely any revenue for the city. But there are, as you said, Jim, a lot of discussion going on about the property, and there will continue to be in some public meetings, and it'll come before the council. And that was the reason I was trying to clarify the issue about the slab, because that is an important issue. And if there are no underground flumes going anyplace, then that eliminates one large hurdle for doing something with that property.
And that is correct. One of the things that we need to always remember, and I realize that we're all saying, green space has a cost. Trust me, for the guy that has to write the check for the mowing of parks. But there's a major value to having Riverside Park at its green space. There is a lot of discussion about having boat ramps on the mainland, which we have plenty on the island, but very few on the mainland. This, again, opens up those type of opportunities. So there's a value both ways, and I think, Noah, as you know, in the Chamber's discussion, also with the Recreation Department, those type of discussions, it's going to have to be a community decision of what we do and how we do it. As I always say, just follow the money, and I think that we're going to decide, are we going to spend, and Glenn, you're pretty much on it, $18 to $20 million in order to get everything off there and turn it into green space that could do it, or are we going to try to do a little bit at a time?
Do we have the elevation on that site? Are we above? Would a builder have to build the site up anyway? In other words, like we're doing in some of the subdivisions. What's our elevation there?
I would dare say on that lagoon, because when we had the hurricane, we did have flooding, and we built up our floor.
So what we're really saying, if somebody built there anyway, they would have to build it up to meet the flood elevation. So the slab may be less of a problem if we have to build the site up. In some places, we're building sites up 2 or 3 feet now, 4. I've seen them.
Oh yeah, you can go out by the beach, and because we're getting complaints now from the people that have been there for years that now have to look up at their neighbors.
Now let me ask you another question: if we have to build up the site 2 or 3 feet anyway, in our construction, can we pierce through the concrete with pilings and still have encapsulated the issue below us?
Yeah, you can do that, yes.
So we could drill right through it on a construction basis and pour our piers and go on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, and the also in that type of scenario
Right.
you're talking about, you're probably going to encapsulate a much larger area than what this building does.
Big parking deck or something. I don't
That's
know what
correct.
we'd be doing, but we could peer through it and keep moving. So, I mean, how we've adversely impacted the value of the land is still very unclear to me without knowing our elevations and the rest of it, because it appears to me we could build it up and pierce through and keep moving and hold the land values.
Well, and you can, the land value based on that $5 million loss is the highest and best use, and using it with little or no environmental impact. So that's your best case scenario of what you would get after you do all this expenditure of taking the building down and building a substation somewhere else. And that substation is going to have to be in a corridor that has the transmission lines to connect.
Like it did before.
Yes.
And then you have to keep in mind, putting what you put on there to return revenue to the city from a property value standpoint. It takes $3 billion worth of assessed property to create $5 million in ad valorem taxes. $3 billion. So I mean, that'd be a long, long period of time before we'd recoup $5 million through property taxes if it were just simply a residential use.
Yeah, and how was the what this suggests that somehow we've got we must have a land value, highest and best land value, close to $20 million going forward. In order to have a negative $5 million.
It was 12. Was it 12?
It was $12 million.
Yeah. It was the first phase of our report that we received.
So highest and best used land was $12 million on this site.
That's correct. And they were using a mixed use, residential and commercial.
Right.
Well, Jim, and one of the things that, you touched on two areas that I think is very important when we talk about this property. One is there's no more riverfront property being made.
Yeah.
So the city owns it, and the sewer plant to the south, and of course the postal annex to the west. So those three parcels have to be, I think, considered in unison when you're talking about a major plan to do something with that corner. So I think that I know that's going to come out even more so as the days and weeks go by in discussing the total use of all the city property there. And
by the way, Noah, that has been the direction of the city council. At their last meeting, that's what they wanted us to do, is not just go sell the postal annex area, but to include that in what kind of landscaping or kind of development do we see, even using the water and sewer plant, which is another $25 to $30 million.
Right.
And you say million real quick and goes by, but
it's just zeros. Zeros are placeholders.
It's a function of zeros. That's right.
but that's true, and I believe the appraisal for the post office property, the old post office, was about $2 million.
2.2 or something like that.
That's been a few years ago.
No, we just got it updated.
Oh, well, okay.
Because we had Dodgertown at 3 and the postal annex was 2.
Okay.
So we do have a significant amount of surplus property, and some of it very valuable. But in the discussions of each of them, as we have brought out here, with these various commissions and groups looking at it, it's key that, and I'm sure you're doing that, is to provide this financial information to them and understand what happens if you say we want another park.
Well, I'd still like to come back to this $12 million. When we're talking about the highest and best use, that doesn't even consider the remediation cost of the site, does it, Jim? That's gross price, $12 million.
That's gross price. And they did give us some numbers for remediation, but it was minimal remediation, and that's why that delta of the $5 million. If we sold it for 12, we'd still have another 5 invested in the property. Over and above.
That's a little shocking, given the fact that a couple of years back when we about this, we thought we were pretty clear that the soil was not contaminated at that point in time.
That is correct.
That's what we were sort of led to believe, because we said that the tanks could have leaked a little bit, but the tanks appeared to be in pretty good shape at that point in time, right?
What we're talking about, just make sure that we understand, if you sell the land,
right.
Let's say we get $12 million for it. Let's say we sell it. You're tearing down a building for between 5 and 9, and then you're relocating a substation. You take those two numbers, take your $12 million, and that's where you come back to your $5 million loss.
That's clear. I mean, you say you got $12 million, you got against 84 right there without considering the land cost.
Yep.
Right?
Right.
I mean, without considering it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It'd be very difficult to clear the land, and a zero-sum game is the bottom line to it. There's cost exposures.
And it looks like the delta between putting the new building in plus the land against sitting there where we are is pretty thin right now.
Yes,
very thin.
Very thin. That's why we're saying phases, because what we're proceeding on administratively in the electric department is that we're going to try to get us to phase 1. We're going to try to take down the cooling tower, get the gas tanks and all that stuff out of there, remediate whatever soil there is under those tanks, which we think, again, is not that great, and get to that point where the only thing we're talking about is the blue box. We have fiber optics in there, so we envision that we're going to put cameras, so similar to what we do to a lot of our substations. So we shouldn't have to man the building for security. It'll be secured by cameras. We can take our fence in some if, for example, if the rowing association or somebody else wants to use the back and the city council agrees to some type of contract, the back side of the waterfront can be used. And so but it's got limited uses too, because the siltation is taken up and it's very shallow water there, except if you go to the canal. So even a launch there would be somewhat of a challenge unless you go to the northern canal.
And particularly if we have to pick up the site to do anything with it.
Right.
It's going to get more difficult.
You'd also have to secure it under the various Homeland Security and so forth. Provide security if you're going to have multiple use and access to the back there.
Who pays for what?
In the interim.
Yes, because I think a number of years ago they had to take down the trees that were there because
the electric utility would do it.
Yeah, but I mean, we can see it. I mean, it's pretty clear. But it's not going to be palatable to sit there with that building 5 years from now, or 3 years from now. It's going to be there's going to be a lot of heat on the city to get rid of that building.
It will be, but as Randy Old just said, it's be reflective in your rates, and again, you just follow the dollars.
And if I live in the county, I don't care whether or not you take it down.
Yes, you would, because you're part of our ratepayers.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
I would care less about having it taken down if you're going to put it in my rates as a out-of-city resident.
But ironically, you'd probably get as many complaints South Beach as you will from Central Beach.
Well,
so
there's a lot of customers that are on the mainland that.
That's true. They get to see the beautiful front part of it, opposed to the backside.
Not if you're out near Walmart or those malls. Come on, and the business people aren't going to be jumping up and down.
But it is going to be one of those contentious decision-making processes that we will go through as to how we get to that point. It's similar to moving the wastewater treatment plant. I mean, it gets to the point of, how much money are we willing to spend?
And then, more importantly, at the end of the day, it's going to require a referendum to make that final decision as well, right?
Oh, yeah, unless you're going to use it as a park.
Unless you're going to use it as a park. So again, having a plan that you can present to the voters that's a yes or no referendum is another huge, I don't think you can have a referendum that says, what would you like to do with it?
But now, you could have a commercial activity there as long as it's ancillary to the recreation. For example, if you extended and made another marina, and then you had a restaurant that was located there, that's a recreational activity. It doesn't mean you can't charge to use for the activities. It just means it has to be in that recreational mode.
And I'm assuming restaurants are the kinds of things you're talking about the chamber discussing in terms of actually a revenue, maybe a lease maybe a lease site for a restaurant or some sort of a restaurant marina kind of thing that might return
it's
revenue.
not just the chamber, but several of the participants, myself included, thought that as we look at the entire process in all three parcels and trying to come up with something that is revenue generating, but where the interest still remains with the citizens, if that's what they want, because it's their property. Those two pieces are under charter right now, and so that's their land.
Yeah, and
they want to work with it, but a restaurant would be Fort Pierce does that down on the marina there in Fort Pierce, and so I mean, there's opportunities to generate money and still maintain title, if you will, to the property, because there's no more riverfront property.
But you got to remember, the activity's got to be ancillary. I've had people say we'll build 4 restaurants there and have Riverview. Restaurants become your primary. That's in violation of the charter provision. It has to be something like a marina. You can't have one boat dock with one boat in it and build restaurants.
The other part, Jim, was, one of the discussions that I had, and I'll just speak for myself, was having some sort of park function possibly where the power plant is, with the restaurant on the other side, with some sort of catwalk or some sort of mechanism underneath the bridge that connects the two, and something along that line, so that it's still public use land.
Ted, can I ask you to go back through the phases and the numbers a little bit?
Sure.
Would you recapitalize that a little bit for me?
We'll go back to phase 1?
Yes.
Yeah, if you would.
No problem. Okay.
So you think we can raise $800,000 from all those assets in the building?
That number, based on what Power Service did on the initial report, that was their recommendation. It could probably be raised.
Okay.
Does that include the oil that I understand there's still some oil in the oil tanks?
There is some oil in there right now, probably about $75,000 to $80,000 worth, based on the volume that's in there. Ralph and I kind of discussed that, but no, that is not in that 800.
But again, those numbers are something that we would hope would be an offset to the cost of actually removing the oil, taking down the cooling tower, oil tank lines, all of that. So I think the hope, at least I'm staring at the two of them, is that we'll raise enough to offset the cost of doing phase 1, and that'll be somewhere in the neighborhood of a net zero. That's, I think, the kind of the plan. Now, understand, I do this and I know they're going to make a face at me. I'm an accountant. It will be a book loss, because the assets are valued at quite a bit more than $800,000 right now. So it'll generate cash, and it would generate cash to offset the cost to the contractor of doing these activities. But at the end of the year, it'll be a book loss, just like the last time that we
had that last couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
sure.
just
Same
like that.
thing we had a couple of years back.
It'll be a cash flow positive, but it'll be a book loss.
These assets that are being sold under phase 1, they're not part of the transmission and distribution facilities. Those are going to be kept until we build phase 2, the box.
Well, it's kind of complex, because based on what we think, we can remove pretty much most of the generating units. We just got to determine what is tied to the existing facilities right now, as far as your transmission, all your SCADA, all your distribution, all that.
Well, I just to build on what Glenda asked, we talk about 800,000, and we're saying exactly, is that the estimate with everything clears? How much cash is going to flow into, if it's going to be a net zero, or is it going to be $800,000?
Should be about 800,000.
But then the cost of doing those things.
What's that?
But my point is, the 800,000 will generate from selling the assets, but we have to pay contractors to do those things. And so
right, but what you're saying, the offsetting cost, the revenues, 800,000 in revenues coming in, we probably got 800,000 in expenses going out. So the net cost to us is zip. It should be.
Yeah.
I don't.
That's where I'm coming from.
It probably won't be, but okay.
Is that what you're thinking?
But then what about the third bullet there, removing the hazardous chemicals, cooling tower, and the oil tanks, there's a cost associated with that.
That is correct. I don't, we have not done that estimate.
It's about 80 grand.
Is it about 80 for the cooling tower? What about the 2 tanks?
I haven't got the tank numbers yet. I'm working on that. But as far as the cooling tower, that was about an $80,000 takedown.
I'm sorry, how much?
About an $80,000 takedown for the cooling tower.
Okay, so you're still working on those costs?
Yeah, and
Okay.
the tanks, that we will have to take out the support and clean that area up under the oil tanks. So they will obviously have a little more cost to them. But we're planning on that being clean, and that'll be anything outside the building. And we hope it will be a positive number at the end of the day. It was a positive number when we sold not being an accountant, but more of a cash type of guy. We actually made some money when we sold the oil the last time, and got the tanks cleaned up and cleared. So this again, as Ted says, we have around $80,000 we think worth of oil in there, but then obviously the cost of taking that out, and they'll have to clean up the equipment before they take it off site. So.
And again, with the last one where we made money, they just removed it and then cleaned and scrubbed it. They didn't actually remove the tank itself.
That's correct.
And I think that's where the difference comes in. You know, it wasn't that expensive to do. So.
And it was a much greater volume of oil.
That was the bigger
dollars.
tank. Yeah. So I hate to be pessimistic. Yeah, maybe we'll net some, but I don't think it'll be a lot personally. After all the contracting is said and done, well, it won't be a negative, but it probably won't be $700,000 to the positive either.
You won't be able to take down the rest of the building.
Yeah. Ted, you have I think you told us to the utility committee, you have an RFP you're pulling together on the generating units, right? Turbines and things like that.
Yeah, and that's what I discussed on Tuesday. I mean, provided we make a decision today to move forward with after the approval on Tuesday, and your commission approves it also, what I have to do is provide a scope of work, and we'll work with purchasing on that to go out and then put an RFP for that, and then start selling the assets.
Well, the bottom line is after the presentation is I propose a motion to recommend to the council that we go forward with phase 1 as based upon the staff recommendation, but continue with the numbers.
Did you have another question on the numbers, or?
Well, the 1.2 million now, you said that's in addition to the 800,000.
No.
So the 800,000 disappears. It's really $400,000 then on that second bullet, not $1.2 million. So it's 3.5 plus 9.9.
Minus 400,000, right? Nice round 13.
Plus minus 400,000.
It's a nice round 13 million.
Well, and again, that 9.9 is a maximum estimate.
That is correct.
So we're
It could be
working
anywhere from
between
5 to
3.5 to
10
to 9.9, right?
No,
Yes.
it's a minimum of 5.5. You said, wasn't it, for 9 to 9.9
Yeah, within that range.
plus 3.5? No,
Oh, okay, I hear what
You're
you're
talking
saying.
about
3.5 minus
Yeah.
400,000.
But, okay, I was talking about the demolition itself.
Yeah, he was talking about demolition.
So at the top end of $9.9 million, net the additional $400,000 of assets, it's $13 million.
What?
Phase 2 is $13 million total at the top end of the demolition costs. If you knock 5 off of that, we're talking 8. So 8 to 13 at the top end.
Plus unknown, what you do in mitigation.
So it's either, what did you say, 13 something, Cindy?
13 even.
13
Three and a half
or
plus
9.
9.9 minus the 400,000 is 13 million.
Or 9.
Or 5 less than that, which is 8, right?
Yeah.
8.
5.5 and 3.5. Yeah.
I'm just rounding everything up, 5 and 10, 5 and 10. So.
Okay.
And in phase 2, we're not relocating the control building at all, are we? We're staying.
No,
So-
actually, phase 2, we're adding a control building on site.
Yeah, and I notice where we're adding it. I mean, obviously from the land point of view, we're adding it off the center of the building. I'm asking, are we doing it because we're using the existing slab there?
Well, that would actually be in the gravel area in the switch yard. So where you see in the control house now, that's basically a little bit west of the existing building that was there and east of the 69 ring bus.
It's still not clear what.
It's to keep from moving. I think it's just to keep from moving the ring bus. That's the cheapest.
Right.
construction.
You want to stay as close as you
we're
can to
staying
the
with the
existing ring
footprint we
bus.
have, exactly. And that's why we're in the center of the property.
Correct.
But the question I'm asking is if we relocated that to our northern perimeter, right, thereby maximizing the value of the whole land.
It'd be somewhere between the 3.5 and the.
Yeah, I don't
Be
know.
somewhere
I'm
between
just
the
asking a
3.5 and
question. I'm trying to.
And it'd probably be somewhere between the 3.5, the cheapest way, and
Yeah, maybe it's another $1 million or
the
something.
eight,
I don't
which is
know.
totally
I mean,
opposite.
to relocate it to our north perimeter, right?
You see what you're saying?
Yeah.
To a different site.
Well, if you know
To a
if
different
it's-
site or on the same site?
If it's $8 million
Same
to move
site.
it,
On that green area.
if it's $8 million to move it to a completely different site, then you know for a fact you're somewhere between 3.5 and 8. So the question is, how much of that 8 is the physical moving of the
It
ring
should be
bus?
appreciably different, but I don't know. Just asking.
No, Glenn, to answer your question, I mean, yeah, you can move it to the north, but that existing ring bus that is in place, I mean, you're talking about moving all of your transmission to the north, okay, and all the existing distribution that's already currently there, which that's why the cost is at 3.5. But if you start moving it, it will. Yeah, you're right. It will be a lot more than the 3.5. Maybe about another $1 million or $2 million. It just depends how far you move it, but. You want to stay as close as
But
you
if it
can.
maximizes your land values, it may be offset. I don't know. I'm just asking a question.
But here again, if you're going to do that, if you're going to move it even on site, it might make more sense to move it to a less valuable piece of property.
Well, I think you have to consider that. That's for
And
sure.
so that would be part of that whole
No,
conversation.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If it's $6 million just to move it a little farther on the same site, then you got to say to yourself, well, is it worth the extra $2 to get it completely off the site?
Yeah,
I think
no, that's
really
exactly
gonna,
right.
Yeah, it's really going to
In
depend.
phase 2, Ted, would the ring bus still? They would still be out there by the boulevard, right?
That is correct. Right there by the Manatee
Yeah.
parking area.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
How long
And-
would it take to do phase 1? To keep all the transmission and distribution within the building, start the process to sell all those things? How long do you think it take to sell all the assets you want to sell?
We anticipated probably up until July or so, July, August, providing I can get the RFP out in time.
All of phase 1 to be done by July?
Mhm.
But even if you say hold to phase 1, don't we still have to retain the technical abilities to do phase 2 internally? Or, I mean, we got a guy like Ted. What happens? I mean, the skill levels still got to be available to handle phase 2, right?
Correct.
And that is not something we go to the street and hire quick. So we do have a cost going forward if we just sit on phase 1, don't we?
Now, if you sit on phase 1, I wouldn't have to go out to a consultant to do anything. But if you start talking phase 2, yes, I would.
In phase 1, as I understood it, it's just about, or maybe a break even or just a slight profit. Cindy, does it?
Who knows? Yeah.
It really depends. It should at least break even.
even.
And we may end up with some cash left over.
Okay. So at this point, phase 1 would not cost the city, in the end, it wouldn't cost the city anything to do phase 1. Is that correct?
That's the hope.
Let me comment on that. We're going to have to do phase 1.
We have to.
I mean, the fact of the matter, cleaning up the building is going to be taking that equipment out. Those generators that need to come out of the plant. The difference between the phase 1 and going to the full demolition and trying to recover is that we got to make sure when they start taking stuff out of there that the structural integrity of the building is not damaged in any way. So there's only so much they can take out, and if you've been in there, you can see the footprint of some of those generators and what it. I mean, recall how much concrete's under those things, but it's just an incredible amount, and they have the bolts and all that other
Right.
stuff. And so the key is you just don't go in there and just knock the floor out and take the thing away. So we'd have to be very careful as to they do it. But that is really not an option. We're heading down the route of phase one any way we go. So it's
That's right. Yeah. But the question I was asking, though, even if we say we're doing phase one, Jim, the talent to do phase two has still got to be held in-house to make that go forward.
Oh, absolutely. Well, what you really do, and I think what Ted is saying, is you're redesigning a substation
Yeah.
by doing that, and we would have to bring in, an engineering firm to help us do that. But the talent in-house has to be there in order to make sure that they're
facilitate.
working with the information that is viable.
But keeping in mind though that the substation is a T&D function, and T&D
That's
isn't
correct.
going anywhere.
What's that?
We're the people that we're losing our power plant people. This substation is a transmission and distribution function, and that department isn't changing.
That is correct. We wouldn't need the talent of the power plant people.
Oh,
per
I
se,
understand that.
because
Yeah.
that'll be
Oh, I
vacant.
understand that.
Yeah, it's a T&D
I
facility.
understand that.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
We're out of that business. Correct.
But we're staying in the T&D business, and that's
Yeah.
what this
No.
is. So yeah.
But we still have to have some lead facilitated within the city.
Mm-hmm.
That is correct. And obviously, we're going to need power plant people for a few months in order to
Sure.
make sure that we have all this transition taken care of smoothly. And
Sure.
and at the end of the day, what's left over is something we can use.
All right.
Any more discussion? I want to make one point.
Well,
But
it sounds, from what I'm hearing here, is there anything we want to do today besides phase one?
oh yeah, just recommend to go forward with phase one.
And that's it?
Yeah.
Because there's a workshop coming up on the 30th.
Yes.
I don't know what,
November the 30th.
we may get some information out of that. I don't think we're in a position today to do anything.
Absolutely not.
No.
Okay.
Agreed.
Just want to see if we're on the same page.
Yeah, you're right. I just want to make one comment for myself, and that is there's a reserve fund of, about $31 million in the electric fund now?
It's at about 88 days of working capital. It might be 28, I think, was unrestricted cash, 28, 29, something like that.
Well, my point is that is a ratio to the total revenues required?
No, that is, our target has been, in accordance with the requirements of our bond agencies, 90 days of unrestricted cash on hand as a ratio to the expenses.
Okay, but the expenses are going to go down because of the termination of the power plant. So as the expenses go down, 90 days is less than what it is now. Is that correct?
Yes, but not by a tremendous amount, because some of the other, it'll be the differential. So they'll go down some. But again, 90 days is the minimum target, so just keep that in mind. 90 days is considered by bond rating agencies to be the minimum unrestricted
I'm
cash
not
on hand for a minimal rating. Actually, Fitch considers a really healthy AA plus to have 365. So we're striving for the minimum, and we're not quite there. We let it dip down tremendously a few years ago, and we're finally climbing back to the place where our rating agencies, both Fitch and Moody's, in our last two rating reviews, are happy with the trend that we're on. So.
But I think the chairman's alluding to the fact that this is $800,000 is not a rate impact this year. It's a capital expenditure, a capitalized expenditure, one way or the other.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I also wanted to segue into the other, and that is really a crucial part after we go through the next stage in our vote, is what to do with the whole concept of reserve funds, policies, and utilizations. And this is a reserve fund with a policy of the minimum so far, but the same kind of rigor that we're going to begin to today, that Cindy's going to present. It's a sensational job. Should also apply to the other reserve funds and so forth. But having said that, can I have a motion to agree to go forward with phase one as the staff is recommending?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate you moving me up. Thank you.
Now, is Ted going to come back and keep us up informed how this, or this is it, our analysis?
On this, yes.
So this is, Cindy, this is a summary of our analysis on the plant movement and demolition. This is it, the end of the study? This is all we're going to see, the Finance Committee?
Yes. And when we get into the rate study, when the real costs are incorporated into the rate study, along with all the other changes in the OUC PPA in the spring, then we'll be able to see the costs going forward and their impact on the rate.
All right. If this is, if we're at the end of this, let me make a statement here a little bit. Some of us pushed hard to get this OUC situation behind us. And I frankly am a little stunned that this analysis of what was going to cost us to move the plant and all this business wasn't prepared prior to the whole discussion. The reality is we have moved off the plant and we got another $20 million cost expenditure here. And this comes as a surprise to the ratepayers, right quick again. And it seems to me we should have had it somehow included in the discussion. Normally, if I was doing a building, I would have looked at this as, okay, $20 million, I'm capitalizing $20 million cost of moving a plant and getting rid of and going to OUC. Now, they're related. To me, they're related. And Jim, I don't know.
Glenn, they're really not related. You don't have a $20 million exposure unless you're going to take the plant down.
I understand, but
if you're going to remain a substation there, what you've done is you've eliminated your exposure. We just spent $2 million on generators that are 50 years old that we could have another $2 million come up next year.
But Jim, when we have looked at this and said, all right, we're telling our ratepayers we're going to spend $20 million on a plant, and our recovery time is X. It should have been sort of fed into our cost analysis. So
where did the $20 million?
You don't have to spend anything.
You don't have to spend that.
There's no requirement to spend it.
We're talking about it.
Well, only as an option, but no, Glenn, you're not obligated in any format to spend that $20 million.
We're certainly obligated to $800,000, and we may be obligated to the $3.5.
But we're going to recover that just out of the sale, like we said.
The $800,000 is a revenue.
$800,000, I understand, Jim.
Yeah.
We'll recover that.
Yeah.
The $3.5 million, we may not.
You don't have to spend that.
We don't.
Honestly, at this point, just as an analogy, once we do phase one, in other words, at a net zero cost or perhaps even a little gain in revenue, doing something with that power plant site is exactly the same as the discussion about the water and sewer plant. You don't have to do a single other thing.
I understand we don't. But
it's
we're going
optional.
to. It'll be wired up with cameras, and we don't
Ready
have
to
any
go.
people there. It's going to be it'll be just a substation, except it's going to be larger because it has a very large building beside it. But
I think that's going to be politically impossible to do very long.
But again, Glenn, that's when the ratepayers will say, "Are we ready to absorb that cost?" Up until that point, there is not a $20 million, from my standpoint. I love that building.
Yeah,
and for $20 million and for my rate to go up $10, that thing can sit right there.
And Glenn, until we changed that contract, we didn't have the liberty to even seriously consider this.
I agree
we had
totally
to keep the thing up.
Without
we couldn't sell anything.
Without moving the contract, we couldn't do a thing with it.
The place where it was
exactly right.
The place where the two concepts were related, and again, not inextricably, was the actual shutting down of the operations of the plant. That
but I thought all those costs were included in, so I wasn't worried about them.
Yeah. But this, we don't have to do a thing.
That'll just be a large substation for us, and we need a substation. And I mean, it'd be no more additional cost to T&D than running a substation somewhere else.
And it may be our cheapest sub-cost station, leaving it as is for the time.
Yeah, I mean, and there again, if you're going to move it, then that's when your costs come in. But again, those are independent decisions and are not booked until we decide, do we want a $3 million expenditure versus a $9 million?
Yeah.
And that's when it'll come. So you can't book value any of those because those are not givens in any form or fashion. And that'll be obviously an independent decision.
Caught up in the bigger decision about the whole corner.
I understand what you're saying, and that's the reason I asked the question earlier, whether you move it across the street or across the county. there's going to be an expense. If you leave it where it is and don't do anything with it,
Right.
then we're at that break-even point, and that's the reason I'd asked that question.
And we've just upgraded our SCADA system, so we have pretty good control of what would take place at that substation or any other substation. So we're in that process of doing that. So from a ratepayer standpoint, this is going to be sort of a break-even plus a savings on our side in the operation of the electric utility.
Well, Jim, I'm for it. I supported it hard. I think you made the right decision, and I know there's still confusion out there on it, but we made the right decision on the OUC contract, without a doubt in my mind.
But again, just coming back, and there is confusion out there about is this a book value, and the answer to the question is no. But I think Cindy's going to, has pretty well documented what our cost of getting out of the power generation, which all indicators show you that we should not be in the power generation business. And running.
I thought it was. I wasn't confused. I thought all of our shutdown costs were in our figures.
It is.
So I was real confident. I got a little confused when we got hit with it in that last meeting, but this cost is an entirely different. But I think some people are going to say, wait a minute, this should have been discussed before.
Well, even if it would have been, would the decision been any different? I mean, the fact
I don't
of the
think it
matter
would
is,
have.
because our daily operational cost actually goes down.
Right. Right.
This is, the icing on the cake. If we want to make it a clean site, then we can do it. Just has additional cost, but that's over and above getting out of the power generation business.
Yeah.
And one of the other issues that had a life of its own is that people kept saying that the whole OUC contract is going to save us $2.50 in the rates. And it's going to be pulled up potentially based upon the early close down. And secondly, it leaps to about $10 in the second year and on. So that always grated on me in terms of saying that we have a contract. Plus, we get out of the hellacious one we had to 1929.
Oh, we made the right decision. No doubt.
Well, the other thing is the footprint of what's there is going to. I mean, the blue building's going to be there, and everybody's going to call it Big Blue or something. But the oil tanks coming down and cleaning, getting that green underneath, taking off the cooling towers. I mean, it's going to. It is going to be different. So I'm just sort of joking about it's going to be the same building. It really will not be. It's going to be a different type of facility. It's going to have a smaller footprint. And if somebody wanted to paint it a different color, I guess we could get the big blue thing taken care of.
Well, I'm sure I'm going to hear about it from some people. Say, yeah, Glenn, you screwed up again. You didn't consider all the damn costs.
think of it as a positive, Glenn. People are paying attention.
Yeah.
But thank you for the presentation and I think that for the public, if any, hopefully some will watch and understand the depth. So if I can go on to the next issue, you're from the batter's box to at the plate again, Cindy, and I think that if I can just make a editorial comment, that the budget amendment that's going to be presented, although it's comprehensive, essentially is a requirement, is really more of an accounting puts and takes than it is any decision making. But that's just my comment. If you'd go forward, so we can get to really what the critical matter is, which is next in the agenda.
That's a pretty fair characterization. This is actually a budget amendment for the budget in the fiscal year that ended about a month and a half ago. State law requires that we adopt a budget amendment for that before the end of November. And really, and Noah, you know this, for CAFRs, essentially I need an amended budget as a comparison to actual expenditures for the preparation of my financial statements. It sort of is in the books, so it is what it is. There are some good things that happen and some, other things that happen, but all in all, it's good news in the general fund and in several other funds in terms of our overall performance against our expenditures for the year as well as revenues. The general fund in particular, we came in under our estimated total expenditures by about $217,000, which is about 1% of the original budget, and primarily gas and oil, decreases in health insurance and retiree insurance premiums, and we talked about those earlier in the year, not needing the dune restoration, and then just a very slight decrease in operating salaries due to some turnover. The big surprise was coming in higher on revenues by about $245,000, primarily because of state revenue sharing sources, which is, in my mind, very good news for the state's economy. Those estimates are made by the state for us at the beginning of each fiscal year. Those are the estimates that we use in preparing the budget. And you'll notice that the half-cent sales tax and the state revenue sharing sources that we receive were up pretty substantially from the original
It's the
estimates.
second year in a row now.
Yeah,
it's
so I
positive.
consider that to be
Yeah.
excellent news for the state's
Yeah.
economy. So that combined gives us a fund balance increase of about $463,000, about above the amount we originally projected. So it really, and then in the electric utility, we're coming in about $1.4 million of cash carryover at year end, and that is absolutely consistent with the third quarter rate sufficiency that you already saw, and it's the reason that we already did a rate decrease back in September, and part of the reason we have another one coming here at December the 1st. So no surprises there. And then the water and sewer utility fund is about $400 and some thousand better than the cash carryover we thought. Our revenues held really good with our original estimates because of the weather, so we're good there. And some of the littler funds, the cemetery and things like that, actually came in a little better than we thought too. So yes, this is really kind of is what it is, and that's our best estimate right now.
I didn't have a problem with it.
I got a question.
Sure.
Boy, it's worse than a trial book. But on your attachment A to the first budget amendment, the very first page, you look down about midway on the page, account number 001.40, other revenues, $9.9 million. That's half our budget.
It is.
Okay,
The intent
now-
there is that any line item that we're not amending, we just sum them all up as one
Okay,
line item.
all right.
So anywhere you see other general fund revenues, if you had the budget out, it's all the other line items that we're not changing.
All
And the
right.
same for
Because
expenditures.
the reason I asked that is I wanted to know what part of that is the transfer to the general fund from the electric enterprise. Is it-
That's one of the ones we're not changing. So.
Okay, now is that account number 401, 401.990.531.991.004? Is that, which was at the end of the outline of what we just covered, the analysis of the electric utility operating cost savings? Okay, is that what that is?
It's part of it. It is essentially all the, you have general fund revenue line items. You see all the ones that are here.
Okay.
Essentially, that other is all the ones that we're not making any amendments to. And that convention holds throughout the budget amendment. If it's a line item that we're not changing, we just group it all together under other. So
Okay, because-
that's one of them, and so are quite a number of others.
The way it looks to me is that our revenue from Vero Electric is about 25% of our budget.
Yeah.
Our operating fund.
It's about $5.4 million a year out
All
of
right.
20.
It used to be about
It's never-
27.
It's never struck me like that before.
It is part of the 9.9. It's about
All right.
5.4
Okay.
of the 9.9.
That answers it.
Any other comments or discussion?
Just a general comment, Mr. Chairman. Coming from a different environment, we had to do budget amendments each month. And, it still strikes me a little odd that we do once a year, but I'm understanding more and more why that's done. And of course, at the end of the year, in order to bring, as Cindy said earlier, to bring all your accounts, you have to do an amendment. But it concerned me when I first came on the commission that we only did one amendment each year, rather than kind of keeping track of it as we go. But in talking with Cindy and Jim, I feel comfortable there are enough safeguards in place that that's not necessary, and that would be a burden on staff to try to do something like that. So I just wanted to share with you that while it's still a little strange for me, I understand it, and I'm comfortable with this process at this point.
Appreciate that. And actually, if we were heading in a direction at any point in the year where we were going to be over the budgeted expenditures, we would do a budget amendment before the end of the year.
Right.
Because the place where we have a problem is we can't appropriate additional funds above and beyond the total adopted expenditures.
Right.
So if we were halfway through the year and got hit with $500,000 we didn't expect, we would absolutely do a budget amendment right then
And
to make sure that we got council approval to appropriate. What's happened to us in the last few years is we come in under all the time. And frankly, we could probably not do this budget amendment at all and still be fine because it's all underneath. But I appreciate the call.
And that's what I was saying, that, they've got the safeguards in place. So it's not incumbent upon us, I don't think, to push that, because I think it would just be burdensome to staff. And thank you for monitoring those books, Cindy.
And thank you for understanding that.
Well, and we do have the quarterly variance analysis where we go in depth in the commission to any of them, and that Cindy monitors and gives us what the alternatives are. So thank you.
With that, unless you have any specific questions, this was in front of council for first reading on November whatever that meeting was, and then excuse me, November the 3rd, I think it was, and then they will actually be having a final hearing on it at the next council meeting. So if you could give me, if you don't mind, a recommendation for council to adopt this budget amendment, that would be much appreciated.
I'd make that recommendation, Mr. Chairman.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. And that is actually an excellent segue into the bigger topic at hand.
As I said, I want to commend you before you start, Cindy, on what you did provide in the time frame and in great detail on the issue that we had grappled with in terms of the general fund reserve. And what I would like to propose is that we go forward with Cindy's presentation, absorb what we can, and then come back at a later date to have a vote, as opposed to understanding, because it's so complex.
I like the way you put that, absorb what we can.
And I think that's an excellent way to proceed.
Who are you criticizing?
And part of the thing is this is a difficult topic. It's certainly one that I've encountered over the last 15 years of doing this for a living, because it's near and dear to everyone's heart come budget time, and there are definitely some really good best practices and some very large potential pitfalls, ones that I've actually seen as a practical matter. People follow a path that led them into some problems with regard to spending fund balance. So it's a topic that I'm a little bit, very interested in and a little bit passionate about sometimes. But I think if we can walk through this presentation very informally, because I think a lot of this speaks for itself, so I'll just talk to it a little bit, stop and ask questions, really talk our way through this. I'd also like to offer to you, and I can send it by a link, there are some other really great, much more extensive resources I can send that you can review that will help, I think, with your understanding of the topic. So let's just dive right in. One thing I do want to clarify first, though, based on a comment that was made earlier, is what we're not talking about. We are talking right now about the general fund balance, okay? With regard to the other funds of the city, the electric, water, sewer, et cetera, that's a completely different conversation, because those funds are either restricted by law to be expended on certain things, and therefore the fund balance is not at your disposal. For instance, the airport fund balance is not a conversation we can have, because we can't do anything with the airport fund balance except keep it at the airport. The cemetery doesn't have one, et cetera. And the electric utility is required by bond covenants to keep a certain amount of reserves. There's $2 million that's reserved specifically by bond covenant, and then on top of it, we have a bond rating there. It's real, and we get periodic reviews by Fitch and Moody's, and we really have to stay with the targets that are set forth by those bond rating agencies, unless we would like a downgrade in our bond rating. So those utilities we've conversed about in the past, targeted 90 days, which again, I'm happy to share that Fitch information with you. That's a minimum as far as they're concerned. I think I'd like to put those to the side. I think those are fine right now, and we have reasons and external regulatory reasons for our targets for those reserves, and those reserves are not available available for the kind of things we'll be talking about today. So this policy is focused on the general fund, where there's much more flexibility for council with regard to the expenditure of fund balances, and certainly, much more interest in the kinds of things that they can be used to defray. So just to launch in a little bit, as a background, GFOA describes it well, and I quoted it in here. It's really essential that governments have adequate levels of fund balance to mitigate current and future risks, and to ensure stable tax rates. And fund balance levels are also a crucial consideration in long-term financial planning. And again, this is where we get back to the idea of stability over the long haul, as well as the possibility that you want to borrow money in the future, and rating agencies and financial institutions look at your history of exposure of fund balance and of the use of fund balance. Back when we were talking about our 15-16 budget process, the issue came up because at the time there were some proposals to just use fund balance to take the place of taxes to pay for some of the expenses that were proposed in the 15-16 budget. And I think at that time, the council as a whole decided that a couple of things. One, that as a policy decision, they would prefer to have a written policy that was thoroughly vetted before they just simply began appropriating fund balance for expenditures. But more importantly, the conversation we had with council was that one of the key elements of using fund balance is a very bad idea, and that's borne out by pretty much every publication or best practice you see, is a very bad idea to use a non-recurring revenue source for a recurring expenditure. Okay? It's pretty straightforward thought. If your operating budget, your recurring expenses, payroll, salaries, pensions, things that are going to be back next year and the year after that and the year after that, is not adequately funded by recurring revenue sources, then your fund balance is a finite number, and as you eat away at it, it will go away to the point where you don't have one. Or more importantly, you're just kicking the can down the road a little bit if you adopt a budget with salaries and pension and all those ongoing expenses this year, and you're short $500,000. And you use fund balance to fill that hole, well, next year you're still going to be short $500,000, plus probably a little bit for inflation and cost of living adjustments. Yeah, and believe me, I've seen people do it, and that's exactly what happens, because nobody ever wants to be the one that says, well, this is the year we're going to stop spending fund balance and we're going to generate additional revenue sources or cut staffing and salaries. So. But going back to kind of to this a little bit, how do we create fund balance? We accumulate it primarily through budget surpluses like the one we just talked about for this year, and unanticipated revenues, again, like the one we just talked about for 14-15. But it's important to note that in some years the fund balance actually goes down. I mean, it is not a constantly growing, perpetually growing revenue source of any kind. It's a reserve that goes up and down depending on the city's experience. And that's the reason I included at the bottom of this first page some data from the last 11 years. And you can see that in 5 of those years, the fund balance actually went down at the end of the fiscal year and not up. Obviously, most dramatically back in 03-04 when we got hit with the hurricanes late in the year. In September, it went down about $1.3 million. But there have been other points in the last few years where it's gone down. In 08-09, $1.1 million. So it has had a tendency to rise and fall over the last 10 years, and I'm sure if I went back into the last 30, it would look like that as well. So it is not a perpetual revenue source that continues to grow automatically each and every year. What we had talked about when we talked about this last year is that most of the fund balance policies I've been able to find, and just kind of the way that I'd like for us to maybe start thinking about it, is fund balance in a layered approach. Okay, so you really have multiple components of your fund balance designed to do different things for you. The first and foremost one would be a piece of the fund balance that's designated for emergency expenditures. And that would be to provide cash coverage for the expenditures we would need in the event, primarily of tropical storms and hurricanes that needed extensive cleanup costs or caused damage to our infrastructure. And, we eventually get that money back from FEMA if it's a declared emergency. But in the very initial aftermath of a storm, we have to be prepared to pay contractors and in cash sometimes to do this work. You can see what happened and this goes back to the prior thing, in the first years after the hurricane, we went down $1.3 million in that first year in the general fund, came in $1.5 million almost $2.2 million over budget between those 2 years back to back from a storm that happened in September. You know, there were probably, I think, about $6 or $7 million of total citywide expenditures and $1.3 million over budget in the general fund from a storm that happened in late September. So the other thing is that if there is no declared emergency, or if it's something besides a hurricane, like the nor'easters that take out our dunes, you know, we took the dune replacement out of our budget, and now we're counting on doing it out of fund balance as needed, then this money would come into play there. And then also we have to cover deductibles and other expenses if we have an insured loss not related to a storm. I will tell you that I think it's about 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, maybe right in the aftermath of the storms, the city council did establish $2 million as the storm reserve, if you will. What they didn't do, and Noah will appreciate this, is they didn't do it by any formal action that allows me to classify it that way under GASB 54. In other words, I can't show it as committed fund balance because they just talked about it in a meeting and they didn't adopt a resolution or adopt any formal action. But actually in the city's general ledger, you'll see $2 million set aside as a storm reserve that I've never moved out because it's part of the fund balance. So if you look at the suggestion later on that we establish about $2 million, it's partly that and partly the fact that in the aftermath of this one storm, it was about 2.2 that we went down by. So we've got the emergency expenditures part. The next component would be what I would call budget stabilization. And that's the part where every year, sometimes you're over budget and sometimes you're under budget. But when you're over budget, you have a layer of fund balance, if you will, that you can dip into for that particular year without impact to be replaced in a subsequent year. So that's your cushion against things that happen that aren't storm or emergency related, but that happen in your budget. We just experienced a upsurge in state revenue sharing. If some bad thing befell the state of Florida, it would go the opposite direction for a year or so, and we might need to dip into it for that. If we had equipment failures or infrastructure problems with our aging infrastructure is not that unlikely, this would be the piece of fund balance that would allow you to recover from that and then move on and keep that stable budget and that stable tax rate. Down at the bottom of this page, you see the amount that we were actually over or under the original adopted budget for the last 11 years. I think this is a key point. When you look in our CAFR and you go back to the very back that compares budget versus actuals, keep in mind that it is comparing the amended budget versus the actuals. Okay. By definition, the amended budget, unless we've made a terrible mistake, like the one we just saw, is always going to be bigger than the actual expenditures. That's the entire point of doing a budget amendment. Your amended budget is bigger than your final actual expenditures. But what matters to the rise and fall in fund balance is your original budget versus your actual expenditures. So when you look at the amended budget versus actual expenditures, and it came in, $300,000 under, what you really need to do is compare that final actual number to the original budget. That's the amount that's going to dictate your rise and fall in fund balance, because that's the amount that you thought you were going to spend when you started last year. Example, your budget's $20 million, your original budget's $20 million. Then in September you have a hurricane, and you know you're going to spend $2 million, and you adopt a budget of $22 million, amended budget of $22 million, okay? And you spend $21.5. Your CAFR is going to say you came in $500,000 under budget. Your fund balance is going to go down by $1.5 million. So it's really important to make that distinction if you go back and look at historical data and you start comparing budget versus actuals. Make sure you're comparing what we spent to the original budget, not the amended budget, which is always going to be bigger unless there was an error. Does that make sense? Or Okay.
Yeah, because this year it was like 43,000 estimated, and it came in at 505,000 under, for example.
But there are years, and this is, I guess, probably 12, 13 would be one of your better examples, maybe even 11, 12. If you look at the At the CAFR, at original versus, or at budget versus actuals in the schedules in the back, it looks like we came in under, but in reality, the fund balance actually went down because we came in over the original adopted budget by several $100,000. So it's an important distinction. So anyway, this shows just over the years how we've gone up and down versus our original adopted budgets versus what we've actually spent. And again, the swings are pretty wide. From $1.5 million over to $600,000 and $700,000 under the adopted budget versus the actuals. And then the last piece of fund balance that needs to be considered is what I call the working capital component. Just in practical terms, we have a good 3 months of our fiscal year where it's operations as usual, and things like payroll and pension costs and all that are fairly well pro rata. They chug along steadily at 1/12 of the year, but our biggest sources of revenue don't come in until either late November, December, early January, primarily ad valorem taxes, which don't start to flow for a good 2 months of the year.
So are you saying that if we didn't have this fund reserved, we couldn't meet some of our bills in October and November and December?
From a cash flow basis, we usually dip down about $2 or $3 million in that first few months of the year because we have the same bills, but we have very seasonal revenue, and that's a very practical reason. That's the very first, if you will, the fundamental piece of fund balance. Mm-hmm. You have to have cash flow.
And Cindy, that's probably one of the little understood events that take place in city or county government, and that is because of its tax base. Your money, you have budget, but you don't have cash. And there used to be a provision that would allow you to borrow money against your taxes. But the problem is there is no cash to pay the bills unless you've put some back from your reserves. And so, and that is a difficult concept for some folks to understand. You have the budget, you just don't have the cash. And so, and it is tricky because your tax revenue is not coming in until November, December, but your expenses start accruing, September, October. So just a little FYI.
Yeah, and that's a great explanation. And it is, a lot of people don't realize how seasonal a good chunk of our revenues are. And so, as a result, that first couple of months, you dip down cash flow-wise pretty substantially. It recovers by the end of the year, but it takes time. And so the very first, most fundamental piece of fund balance is to keep enough working capital that you don't have an issue with that cash flow carry in the first 3 months of the year. The problem becomes that it's like the perfect storm. These three things, at least two of them, will tend to happen in the same period of time. If we're going to have a storm event of some kind, it's probably going to impact us in September, October, and November, right at the point where our cash flow is at its lowest ebb. And depending on the nature of the event, it may well impact, for the rest of the year, our sales tax revenues and our other infrastructure costs. And so that's the reason I'm proposing that, essentially you really need three pieces and you need to think of them separately. And when you come to the place where you use one of them and it's time to replenish it, you're replenishing it from different sources too. For instance, if we spend our emergency expenditure money, our $2 million, well, chances are pretty good if it's a normal event, we'll get that money replenished eventually through, FEMA and insurance reimbursements, although we'll have to hope, as we've seen, that 10 years down the road, FEMA doesn't change their mind and come and take it back like they have. But eventually we'll replenish that through, sources of not our own. We just need that money to start with. If we dip in to our budget stabilization layer, again, we've seen over the years, some years better performance than others. Given a 2 or 3 year time frame, that budget stabilization money should be able to put itself back with some, controlled spending in a subsequent year. The working capital is what I'm considered to be, wherever we set it, the minimum fund balance. Those other two layers can go down, but there's a low water mark you can't go below that you really need to hold as your working capital, as your reserve, particularly if you've spent your emergency expenditures and now it's the following year and you have another hurricane event, which can happen, and you're in, again, that low cash flow point of the October, November, December time frame. So, and then now we come to some numbers. I've heard a lot of numbers. in the course of this conversation since the summer, and I will tell you there is no one-size-fits-all approach to appropriate fund balance percentages. There is no publication out there that will tell you it should be this amount. Okay? They will all tell you what they think minimums are, and then every one of those publications, and I've included a couple of them here, will say, however, your circumstances as a municipal government or as a government entity are what govern what's appropriate for you. Your consideration of the likelihood of emergency expenditures, how volatile your revenue sources are, how much control you have over them, the timing of certain things. So you may start with a minimum recommendation from some of these agencies, but it's really up to you, the specific government, to figure out what works for you and what makes sense for you and what gives you, that good risk coverage that you believe is appropriate. I will tell you, in addition to talking about percentages, I think you need to consider the dollar amount produced by that percentage. And I give the example, GFOA says minimum recommended reserve 17%. In the case of Vero, that would be $3.7 million for emergencies, cash flow, budget stabilization, and I've got to tell you, I'm a bit of a conservative, but I think to have a fund balance of $3.7 million for all of those things and no more than that would be really inadequate in our situation. I mean, that would barely cover my cash flow dip in October, November, December. It sure wouldn't manage to handle hurricane expenditures plus that. So you throw those percentages around, but think about what kind of dollar amounts they mean too. What I've suggested here as a starting point to talk about is emergency expenditures as a fixed amount of $2 million, kind of based on what we talked about earlier. Budget stabilization layer of about 10%, which at this point would be about $2 million. And working capital at 25%, which is essentially about 3 months of cash flow. And so, when we come back to talking about the numbers, that's the starting point that I think that we could talk about. More importantly, though, let's talk about how you would calculate what is quote-unquote excess. What I'm suggesting is that every year in March, we get a CAFR. And when we get the CAFR, we know what the audited unassigned fund balance number is. Okay? That is an audited number at that point. When we get that CAFR in March, if we take the audited number and we compare it to the budgeted expenditures and transfers for the year that we're currently sitting in, and we take out the $2 million first and then apply the other percentages, we would then know how much excess fund balance we have at that point. If we knew that in March, we could do one of three things quite easily. We could amend the current year budget to spend it during the current year on things that we may have had to, forego in the budget process, capital projects and such. We could leave it so that when we start the budget process a few months later, it's available for appropriation in the subsequent fiscal year, or we could just let it roll, particularly if we have a situation that is down toward the bottom where we've depleted one of these balance categories, then we could let it help to replenish those balance categories. I think probably the key element of this, though, is this page that's entitled Appropriate Uses of Excess Fund Balance. I think this is where a big part of the conversation comes in. And this is a really central part of the policy, and this is one of the things we talked about extensively at the budget workshops. If all of the fund balance policies and best practices I've ever seen do seem to agree on one thing, and that is it is not advisable, as we talked about, to use a non-recurring revenue source such as fund balance to support recurring expenditures. It just puts you further behind in the following year. It's a finite resource. The best uses of fund balance, and this is what I've incorporated into the draft policy, are things that are one-time expenditures, and even better, one-time expenditures that reduce future operating expenditures. Example, you've got a building that's falling apart and it costs you a lot of money in repairs and maintenance every year. You take some excess fund balance, you go and you use it on the one-time expenditure of bringing that building up to snuff. Not only have you done a one-time expenditure, you've saved yourself some operating money going forward in terms of the repair and maintenance cost that building is costing you. And certainly capital projects and deferred maintenance is a subject that's dear, I think, to all of our hearts right now. Whether it be paving, our recreation facilities, some of the stormwater projects we've had to, sort of put on hold and off to the side as we contemplate another source of revenue through a utility or not. Even something as simple as putting some money into the city's frozen defined benefit pension plan. That would, one, be a one-time use, and two, would actually, again, potentially reduce your future operating expenses as you lowered that unfunded gap. Next year's contribution to the unfunded liability might be smaller, and that's an ongoing expense in your general fund. The OPEB thing we talked about. Again, that was a little tricky because you really have to set up a trust first before you can throw money in, and putting money in once probably won't fly without an ongoing fund. During the budget hearings, we talked about paying debt service with fund balance, and an annual debt service payment is a recurring expenditure. It lasts for the life of the loan. So the policy that you have in front of you allows for using excess fund balance to defease debt, in other words, to go pay off a loan, but not to just apply fund balance to a debt service payment, because that's just a recurring expenditure. It's just like pension or salaries or any of the rest of that. It's going to be back in the following year, and then you're going to be that much further behind. As a matter of fact, the policy as presented includes a very specific definition of a recurring expenditure as being something that has been in the budget for 2 years prior and is in the budget for the coming year. And then there's a little bit of discussion here at the bottom about how to replenish fund balances that fall below the target levels. Again, as we talked about, you'd replenish your emergency reserves with insurance proceeds or federal state disaster relief funding. You can allow budget surpluses in subsequent years to accumulate until acceptable levels get reached. And you could actually budget for a surplus if things fall far enough behind. I think particularly when it comes to the budget difficulties that we faced here in this past summer, and just like we talked about, the potential for another $463,000 from the 14-15 budget by budget amendment, to me, the easy, obvious thing is capital projects. When we went through our budget process in 14-15, we ended up adopting a general fund budget that had no capital expenditures in it. The revenues that we created and the tax rate that we adopted covered our operating expenditures and nothing else, which I consider very appropriate. But we took out all of the money that we had put in to fund capital projects because we didn't have it. And so that would be, I would think, the first thing that we would consider if we determine as a result of this that we have some extra fund balance from last year. Let's put back that $500,000 that we were going to give to paving, stormwater projects, whatever else. We talked a little bit about during budget season about the fact that we have sort of commingled these two things in our mind, I think, to our detriment. We've got your general fund operating expenses. The capital costs were always over here in the 1 cent sales tax fund by themselves where they belonged. But there's nothing wrong with taking general fund balance and adding to that capital project fund to help increase the amount of money that you have for the aging infrastructure that we have. The place where there's a problem is essentially budgeting for operating revenues that are less than your operating expenditures and going in the hole to deplete your fund balance. I consider to be not only a kind of a dangerous path, but also something that in this draft policy is kind of expressly not allowed. So with that is enough talking from me. I'm happy to answer any questions or open the discussion.
I'd like to make a point, if I might ask a question. It's on this principle not to use a non-recurring revenue source, such as our fund, to support a recurring expenditure. I think it was either in the budget workshop, August or September. The council deviated slightly from that by dipping in, I think it was to 1,000 or a million into it to come up with the increase in the budget expenditures with a 2.5–3%. And the issue was, do we take it out of the fund balance, the $9 million, or give the full millage increase in taxes? Okay, so they sort of did a split.
Actually,
compromise.
They didn't, though. At the end of the day, they decided not to dip into the fund balance at all. Right. At the end of the day, the way they compromised was they did the millage increase to cover operating expenditures, and they took the $500,000 that they were going to spend on capital and they removed it from the budget. So there was no the budget. The adopted budget does not deplete the fund balance at all.
But the issue was the direction that we had from the city council was to reduce taxes without reducing services.
And so we
Yeah, but,
eliminated the capital expenditures is what we did. We eliminated the $500,000 in capital expenditures. So the adopted budget does not deplete the fund balance at all.
Okay, I guess then I don't need to ask the question, but the question I was going to ask was, how do you think that is going to affect the current financial situation and the current budget if they would have dipped into the fund? Because something came up here where we got, I think, $250,000 from the state revenue sharing, was it? So that if we would have dipped into the fund, that would have offset the. Let's say I thought we dipped into it for $1 million. I guess I didn't understand, but okay. But that would have knocked off 25% of the cut into the fund if we got the revenue sharing of $250,000, which we did.
But again, it wouldn't. And this is where I want to be. I want to make sure that we're all really, really clear on at least what I'm saying. Your general fund right now is made up almost entirely of recurring expenditures. It's 70% payroll, pension, health insurance, et cetera. Okay? So you budget for a certain amount of expenditures, and you budget for recurring revenue to cover those expenditures. All right. If you then spend a little less or take in a little bit more, and I know $200,000 sounds like a lot, but in the scheme of 20 plus million, it's really less than 1%.
Right. Sure.
Then your fund balance increases at the end of the year. What I'm proposing is that anytime that you have an increase in that fund balance, once you've established a minimum that you want to hold on to, you can take that money and you can say, what's a one-time thing I can do with this, like a road or a bridge or a building. But that you're not adopting a budget in any year where your operating revenues are not sufficient to cover your operating expenditures. Okay? Because what happens there, and this is essentially what I think what you're asking, what happens there is the following year, you're automatically that much in the hole, plus cost of living adjustment, and the year after that, and the year after that. I've actually seen a situation where, a government said, here's our fund balance target. We want it to be $2 million. We have $2.5 million. So we're going to budget this fiscal year to eat into it by $500,000 with raises and personnel costs and all that. So they came to the end of that year, and they hadn't eaten into it as much as they wanted to. So they said, okay, now we're in the next fiscal year. Now we're going to budget a budget that's upside down by $700,000 to try to get to our goal of $2 million, gave raises yet again. What happens when you get to the following year? In other words, it's the same as using your savings account, I think I use this analogy, to pay your mortgage. Eventually, you're going to be out of your savings account, but you're probably still going to have your mortgage. And so I think it's really important that operating revenues cover operating expenses, and a excess fund balance is almost like a one-time windfall. And you say, wow, now I have this chunk of money. What is something I can use this on that's going to bring me benefit and that may actually reduce my costs going forward? Let me fix a building that's a real drain on my maintenance costs. Let me put some money in my unfunded pension. Let me pay down the principal of a debt, not a debt service payment, because that's like using your savings account to pay your car loan. Again, eventually you're out of savings, but you still have a car loan.
Cindy, for clarification purposes, talking about this year's budget with the issue we were sharing here, actually what you didn't do is you didn't budget an extra $500,000 in capital, which meant that you weren't going to put the money in capital. Instead, you budgeted over in the general fund. Is that correct?
The original version of
in the operating part of the general fund?
No. The capital fund, you have the general operating fund, and then we have the 1 cent, the capital construction fund. Originally, the original version of the budget had some increase in operating costs, and it had a $500,000 transfer over here to the capital fund.
Right.
What we did was we eliminated that transfer.
Right.
The capital construction fund was left to with the money that it had coming in from 1 cent sales tax and nothing else.
Okay, so there was no general fund transfer.
There was no general fund contribution.
Gotcha.
That's what they did to balance it without eating into fund balance for operating costs.
When you're talking about the...
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think the big point of that whole discussion was permanent revenue was matched with permanent expenses. That's what was the critical question. The capital expenditure was not the critical. It was matching revenue to permanent expenses. And that's what the city council finally did, which was the appropriate answer, no question about it. Right. Right.
With the understanding that if we had a fund balance, if we came in better on our budget at the end of 14-15,
That's different.
there's nothing to stop them from taking that $463,000 right now through budget amendment and putting it in the capital fund.
Yeah.
The only thing you can't, as you know, the only thing you can't change once you've completed your budget process in the summer is your millage rate, but you can amend any other portion of your budget at any point during the year, as we discussed, that you want. So that money is available as we speak for them to put into capital in the current fiscal year.
Cindy, now, as a former budget person, I appreciate a large fund balance. In many places that I've been, they set aside an amount and you budget your fund reserve first. It's your savings account. You put it aside, and then you distribute the rest of your revenue across your general fund. When I look at this, and you mentioned the $2 million for emergencies, that strikes me like, as opposed to reserve, and I'm probably not using your same terminology, but more like a trust fund that sits there, and you don't use that money for anything. But that's not really true in this scenario, right? It's really a part of the reserve.
Yeah, in this context, what we do, and things have changed a little bit since the GASB 54, in this context, what I'm suggesting with the draft policy is that we define it as a committed fund balance under GASB 54. So it gets set aside in a separate chunk in the reserved fund balance.
Okay, so it's a separate line item in the
separate
reserve.
line item. It would be committed fund balance $2 million, and then these other two components would simply be a target percentage for the unassigned fund balance.
Okay, this is just a question, Mr. Chairman, for us. Since I thought I heard you say that was nothing that the council had actually voted on, would that be something that we might consider suggesting or recommending?
My intention is.
Actually, it's in, if you just, I'm sorry, I missed
Or
this
is that
part.
going to be
The
part of
attachment,
this?
The attachment A is what I'm suggesting to be adopted by council.
Okay.
This attachment would be added to a resolution or an ordinance, and this would be the actual adopted policy. All the rest is just white
Okay.
paper, but attachment A would be the adopted policy, and it does specify the $2
All right.
million.
Now, the other thing, when I look at your reserves, and like I said, I would want as much reserve there as I could get, simply because you never know what happens in the course of a year. But with your 35% and then your additional $2 million for your emergency, basically our fund balance is 45% of our general fund budget. It just seems high to me. Can you explain? I mean, you've done a good job of explaining, but 45% of your budget set aside for reserves seems like an awful lot of money.
And that really is, this right here is really the point of, I think, the point of discussion. If we can agree, maybe collectively, that the policy as written with regard to not spending fund balance on recurring expenditures and having these layers of fund balance and the rest of it, that it's appropriate, then I think we could focus our discussion on the percentages. I'm with you. I think the fund balance we have right now is fine, and I find it very... I want to make sure we proceed very carefully when we start spending it and dipping into it. Are these numbers high? I think that's the real discussion. What percentages do we think are appropriate to recommend?
Okay. Well, I certainly think that trying to use reoccurring expenditures with non-reoccurring revenue is a recipe for disaster, and I think everyone up here agrees with that. Not speaking for my colleagues, but I've been around them long enough to know that I think they feel comfortable with that. And setting aside specific components, I don't have an issue with that. So that's just my comment, Mr. Chairman.
I just want, go ahead.
Let me say that, I've gone over it very carefully, and I don't find that the reserves are too large. I think you're right on. We got a 90-day quarter, and it costs us about $1.9 million a month to run the place, and $1.9 million times 3 is $5.7 million. Boom. That's quick, and we need that. The emergency fund, I think we're always subject to the storm situation. the $2 million. It could go quick. There's no doubt about it. And we can't invade the working capital to cover that. So that's a base cost. We have to cover that. That's self-insurance. I don't think there's any doubt about it. Now, the only difference I have with your program, Cindy, is this. In my mind, the base cost is the first item, A item. The second cost is clearly working capital. That's the B item. The C item, the last 10%, is our wiggle room if we screw up the budget. Now, I think all that works, and I think the wiggle room, you could argue maybe it's a little high or a little low. I think when I look at the budgets, you could make a case, and I'm not trying to make a case, but you could make a case that maybe that's a little on the high side because the variabilities in our budget are pretty controllable unless something goes haywire. So, but when you look at the numbers, it's still only 10% of the deal or our whole budget. So that still seems to work to me. I think that's a pretty fair budget. My analysis is the way you got it structured. You go from the emergency fund to the wiggle room, the 10%, and then you go to the working capital. It really ought to be reversed, so that the first thing we're going to deplete is the wiggle room, right?
Absolutely.
That's the first item we're going to do. And that's our $2 million cushion against the working capital, in my mind. Now, I've gone over it, and I agree with everything you got here. The only thing I think we ought to define capital expenditures a little clearer. I think capital expenditures is anything that extends the life of the building for 3 years or something. It's just not, wrapping up $200,000 worth of expenditures and calling them capital expenditures. They really should extend the life of the property by some amount. 3 years is normal. Tax code would say it'd be a whole year, but it certainly ought to be over 3 years if it's going to be a capital expenditure. So I would sort of move up the definition a little bit. The other item, when you're talking about defraying debt, what you're talking about doing, you're saying paying off the debt. And I guess you could argue you could pay off the debt and then clearly move up the operating expenses by a like amount. That's what it sort of implies. And I don't think that's the intent of the situation, right?
Well, if you paid off a debt, if you paid off a debt in a particular fiscal year, which we've done a couple of times, the following fiscal year, you wouldn't have that recurring expenditure. And that would give you budget flexibility the following year. But that would be part of the following year's budget discussion.
Right. I think the danger, of course, is that we make the statement and we could clearly increase the operating expenses disproportionate in a year or two if we were not careful about the thing. Now, I'm happy with saying, yeah, we could put it in capital expenditures, provided it extends the life of the property 3 years or we're building a building. That makes sense to me, right? And I think we could deplete the wiggle room fund, that last 10%. But we can't deplete the working capital room, or we can't deplete the base cost. So we only have a 10% wiggle room in the whole darn deal that I see, right?
And actually, and maybe this is the place to, if you look at attachment A, which is the actual draft policy,
yeah.
I agree with you. It actually says in that order, we might use the $2 million and we might drop below 35, but remain above 25. But in no circumstances will we drop below the 25. That's the way I've worded this, and I agree with you.
Right.
That right there is the floor. You don't go lower than that working capital.
And I'm not a lawyer, but I read pretty carefully and trying to keep looking at it carefully the way you've got it. And you've done a great job of getting it done. Clearly, it looks like you're defining our committed funds as the first $2 million. And that's a defined term in my mind. So that's a capital C. That should show up. The next thing you're doing is you're throwing it all into unassigned fund balance. Now,
which is actually a defined term, too. That's the reason.
That's got to be a defined term in my mind.
It's defined by GASB.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And underneath that, then the way it looks like, in my mind, we switch around working capital from being a third item, it's the second item, and the budget stabilization is a third item, because that's our wiggle room. there's no wiggle room in that working capital that I can see, right?
But exactly, and if you look at Section 8 of the draft policy, it actually says if the unassigned fund balance goes below 35 but remains above 25, then we'll put it back. But the final paragraph says, in no circumstances shall the general fund unassigned fund balance be budgeted or otherwise appropriated in such a manner as to cause it to fall below the targeted 25% for working capital. In other words, it says you've got this piece, and you might dip into this piece occasionally, but you're not allowed to go below the 25%.
See, that's my point. You're using the wiggle room as a top item. That's the one we can deplete or not deplete. But we can't go below the working capital.
Exactly, and that's what it says. It under no circumstances shall it go below that working
And
capital.
and the thing when looking at it, the way it's set up, you're replacing funds. But wouldn't you be in reality? Let's suppose we got hit with a storm. And we blow out $3 million. Now we're $1 million down, right? Mm-hmm. Now what is really going to happen? We're going to have to replace the $2 million. Let's say we have to put up another $1 million. Now clearly, that's not going to come out of the working capital. We can't take it out of that. It's going to come out of the wiggle room fund. So what would City Council be expected to do prudently? Take the wiggle room fund by about $1 million and replenish the base fund first, and then rebuild the operating wiggle room. Mm-hmm. So when I look at the formulas here, rather than talking about rebuilding over a couple of years on the base cost, it should be deplete the next line item, which is going to be the stabilized fund. That would bring it down to $1 million on our current numbers, and then we're going to have to face up to rebuilding that under your formulas over the next 2 years, the way you got it structured, right?
And those time frames are certainly can be discussed.
I understand.
The way I've got it is that if we use the emergencies, that's the thing we replenish first. That we do it with FEMA money and insurance proceeds. And if we can't get it all back through those two things, then we restore it. We restored that anyway within 3 fiscal years, and that the other ones have a little longer time frame to be restored. The budget stabilization has a little time frame to be restored.
Here's the problem with that: we're rebuilding the base at 3 years. In the meantime, the wiggle room fund still could be depleted. Mm-hmm. The reality is, it sort of logically just says, okay, if we got a negative position on the base cost, say $500,000, we have to pull it back out of the stabilization fund, and now we get a base cost of $2 million, balance of $2 million, and we got a wiggle room fund of $2 million less than $500,000. Mm-hmm. That seems to me the logical deal, because we're not going to deplete the working capital. Mm-hmm. And
we would hope not anyway, since this policy says that we don't. We don't want to do that.
I've gone over it carefully. I think you ought to think about that a little bit. And then when I read the written document carefully that we're talking about, it's not clear to me. In section, let's see, Cindy, section. If you note, in section 5A,
there you go.
Right? Termination of excess funds. We talk about how it can be used. Now, to me,
we're talking about 6?
Yeah, 5.0, determine excess and balances.
Oh, determining the excess, okay.
Yeah. When we're talking about that, that's the amount of the total funds left after subtracting the 3 main items, base cost, working capital, and stabilization fund. That's what's left, right? Now, 1, 2, and 3 implies that it can be used for any operating costs in 1, 2, and 3.
But that's just the determination of the amount. 6, section 6, it says is the allowable uses.
Yeah, but read what it says here, Cindy.
It says the excess may be used for allowable expenditures as defined in section 6 below through one or more of the following actions. So that's the budgetary action you would take, but you can only use it for the things that are outlined in section 6. And that's where.
Then why, okay, excess may, look at the last sentence, excess may be used for the following as defined, and it puts these three items. And then we get down to 6, and again, look at the last paragraph, and you see if there's some confusion here. And all I'm trying to do is there some confusion in the paragraphing?
Right, and here was the intent, and then maybe there is, and I'll have another look at it. Oh,
Yeah.
If you read the last sentence in 5, the intent of 5 was just how it gets appropriated, not what it's appropriated for. And that's why it says the excess may be used for allowable expenditures as defined in Section 6 below through one or more of the following actions. So that was really about, you can either appropriate it in the current year, you can leave it until budget season, or you can leave it entirely. That was the process for using it. Whereas 6 was intended to be, and now that you've decided the process for using it, these are the items you can actually use it on. And I hear what you're saying about maybe a better definition of capital improvements down here.
Yeah,
in the second
and
year.
our last sentence says, unless otherwise prohibited by law, excess fund balance. Now, that's not the defined term, but I presume it is, and it's just not there.
Up in the,
Yeah.
it's defined in 5, essentially.
Includes one-time capital improvements. See, now there we're using excess fund balances, see?
As
And I
defined
think that's,
in
the
5.
way I read that, that's a defined term, and that's, again, the net balance left after the calculations, correct?
Exactly.
That's the way I've got it.
And I can point that back to 5, but essentially, yeah, that's the amount determined to be excess under Section
Yeah.
5.
And again, come back to the last sentence, and it reads it. Debt service payments, which by definition are non-recurring items.
No, it says debt service payments which do not
Yeah.
meet the definition of a non-recurring item.
I have some difficulties with some of the language. Maybe we could clean it up a little bit.
Sure.
You see, and I come back to 8.0, I come back to just what I said. 8.0 first paragraph talks about the 2 million. In my mind, we should put a paragraph in there or a sentence in there. If funding is inadequate, if that falls negative, if it falls below our base cost, the first thing that has to happen is we deplete what I call a wiggle room fund and bring back up the base. That makes the city council then look at the fund balances correctly.
I mean, maybe it's as simple as just taking the 3 paragraphs and putting them in the
Yeah, that's what I'm
opposite
saying.
order.
Maybe we can just,
I mean, in other words, instead of the paragraphs are fine, but maybe the first one should be in no circumstances does it fall below 25%. And then the second paragraph should be if you get below 35%, then here's what you do. And then the final paragraph should be here's what happens with the emergency reserves. Maybe it's just a switch in the order.
yeah, but you could still get below the 35% and have a depleted base cost, could you not, under your formula?
You could get below the 35% and still have a depleted emergency
That's my
disaster.
point.
Yeah.
Right.
The emergency disaster reserve sort of sits out here by itself.
See, that's my point.
Okay.
I don't think we should have the base depleted, partially depleted, and still have the 35% running. They should be melded together in the event of that situation.
In other words, the emergency disaster reserve is the priority.
Yeah, probably. But you know what I'm saying.
I do. It's the number one priority.
Yeah, it seems to make sense, right?
If you had to choose between, if you've depleted your emergency funds, and you had to choose between having emergency funds and having your budget stabilization layer, emergencies come first. The emergency reserve.
Absolutely right, because
Okay,
that's
I understand what you're saying.
Well, essentially, you're talking about restricted funds.
What's that?
Restricted funds. In other words, you just don't mix and match, that you do have the priorities, and they're reserved for these specific reasons.
Right.
And as you said, the accordion flexible wiggle is that last one.
Right, and we're under more strain to fill the stabilization fund in this formula than we were the base costs. Under this situation, I think we had 4 years to fill the base, 3 years. And under the stabilization, we got 4 years.
It was a shorter time. It was all I did here was
Yeah.
make it a shorter time frame on the
See,
emergency.
and I think
fund.
if we just say if we get hit It's got to come out of the stabilization fund.
I hear what you're saying. I'll find a way to write that gets replenished first.
Does that make
essentially.
sense?
Yeah. That's what I had assumed would be done, is that the other ones are priorities as opposed to, as you pointed out, the stabilization, which is
If I may, Glenn?
Sure.
Cindy, a couple of questions, I guess. When I look at budget stabilization and I look at working capital, I have a difficult time separating those two because in reality, and I don't mean this disparaging, so please don't take it that way. It's a hedge against some revenues ups and downs. When you look at your budget stabilization, it's to protect against the potential volatility of the operating revenues and expenditures, which is the same as the working capital if your revenue doesn't come in when you think it might. In other words, if you don't get a large distribution in November and it comes in December, then it's going to throw you behind in your cash flow.
I would see the working capital as more of a timing issue, and the stabilization is more of it's not coming at all.
But it's,
in other words, we had a revenue source we were counting on for this year. It's not coming at all, not at any point. Or we had a huge expenditure this year we didn't expect. To me, that's we adopted a budget and we were off the mark. The working capital part is more I'm getting my money, I'm just not going to get it until January.
It's a cash flow.
Well, it's a cash flow consideration.
But when you look at what you have here, it's still that, because you're going to have money that you received. You're going to have cash money that you received in the previous year that's going to help you come through with some of that cash reserve or for the cash payments in the upcoming year. Because
all I'm going to have is my fund balance. All I'm going to have is whatever I have left over on September the 30th.
But you're going to have some cash. You'll have cash on hand because your revenue, your fund balance that you have is cash in the bank.
Right. But I guess I'm still seeing, and probably the better description is at the bottom of attachment A, there's a difference between, to me anyway, the working capital component, which is there for me to dip down cash flow-wise and come back up at the end of every year, and the part that's there because of unexpected budgetary impacts. The cash flow is a completely different issue. At every September 30th, I have a certain amount of cash. It goes way down and then comes back again if my budget's accurate. But if my budget isn't accurate, I'm also going to have a downturn in cash because I spent more than I thought, or that's permanent. One is a timing issue and one is a permanent issue for the year.
But you do have cash, and
only if I have a fund balance, which is the point of the working capital.
Well, I know, but you always have a fund balance. I mean, you project and you budget for a fund balance, so you're always what it looks to me like It looks to me like these two items could be combined into your fund balance, because your fund balance is there to take care of any issues that you might have where you don't receive the revenue that you think you're going to get. Because each year you have overages in your budget. On a good year, you have overages in your budget, and you've already got that cash in the bank from the previous year. And when you look at the stabilization, that is exactly what fund balance does. It protects you against unexpected either excess expenditures or under-received revenues. And so I'm having a difficult time understanding why you need two components of one called working capital and one called budget stabilization when a reserve fund balance would, in my thought process, would do the same thing.
Well, in the past, fund balance was, especially before GASB 54, it was just a big old bunch of money. I mean, there's no requirement that you have any individual components of fund balance. But, the best practices recommendations, and it makes sense to me, say it's probably a really good idea to categorize for clarity for everyone why you have the fund balance that you have, instead of it being sort of an undetermined chunk of money. So again, for me, there's a cash flow component, whatever's appropriate, that has purely to do with that's the absolute minimum of cash that I can have on September the 30th and still make it through to December and pay all my bills. Yeah. And then the budget stabilization layer is kind of there that you may dip in and then replenish, dip in and replenish, depending on your performance against budget in any given year. In other words, if I have $3 million in cash and then I have an adopted budget, if I come in over budget, I'm going to be dipping into my absolute minimum $3 million. So what you're doing is you're putting another layer there, so that if, let's say, you come in over budget a couple $100,000, next year you come out to the good a couple hundred, you've got this part here that doesn't cause you to get into your absolute core funds that are purely there for cash flow from October through December. Do we need to have individual components? You could just have one giant lump. This was purely for the clarity of this is my absolute bottom line. If we get below this, we've got a cash flow problem. Above that, this is our, as you call it, wiggle room. That was a great way of putting it. And then there's a chunk over here that's just for hurricanes. I mean, it was just really intended for clarity more than anything.
The trigger mechanisms when you hit the certain threshold, and I think it's helpful for clarity in explaining what the fund's use is for, frankly, rather than just have a larger fund, but specifically begin to focus on them and explain it in this way, both to the public.
I think I think you're right, Mr. Chairman. I think as much a public document as anything else, I think it does help the public understand. I mean, people throw around these numbers like it's potatoes. It's $9 million, and you say, "What the hell does that mean?" Let's talk real. And this helps clarify that. The public will read this document, and some of them will come in and say, "Okay, now I understand. There isn't any $9 million in slush funds. That's silliness." But this would help if and I think it's absolutely important to have the working capital differentiated. People have to understand it's just like them living at home. If they lose their job, they should have 90 days worth of cash flow in the bank to cover them. And it's no different than the city. The city needs funds set aside. Things can happen. We do have a variable cash flow, and the public will understand it if we break it out 3 ways, just like you've done. I differ. I want the stabilization on the top. That's where our risk is. We can't be risking the working capital. We can't be risking the base cost. We can play with a stabilization fund within reason, right? If we agree that we're going to rebuild it in these, you say 2 years or 4 years, I think. 2 years, we got to rebuild it. That puts a strain on city council to spend it, right? That's true.
But you make a good point. I mean, in the past, people just had fund balances. I mean, the unassigned, restricted, committed, GASB 54, 400 different names for it. Older practice was pick a good level and just have a fund balance, and that fund balance was there to cover emergency expenditures, budget variability, cash flow needs. It was just a number, and so there's no requirement to do this way whatsoever. It was purely here's the best practices and maybe a better way to explain why we need so much instead of it just being a lump of $9 million. Here's the pieces that it's intended to cover.
Well, let me ask you a question, Cindy. What's our monthly expenditures, just roughly?
I think our adopted budget this year was about 22.
The problem is you have
$1.8 million, almost $1.9 million.
I'm sorry.
Almost 1.8, 1.9.
1.8, 1.9.
But the problem is you have front-loaded. For example, the police pension is paid at the beginning of the year in total. You have insurance payments that come in quarterly. So it's dangerous to begin to try to straight line it and divide by 12. Yeah. You really have to look at all these anomalies, and then we have seasonality on top of that. So
And I've done the cash flow analysis. I mean, I've seen cash dip down
Yeah,
as much as
and
$3 million
that's
in
my
the first
point,
2 months.
is that-
I mean, I've actually done real, like, this is how much cash came in and went out
Right,
October,
right.
November for the last 5 years. I mean, I've done that kind of cash flow
Right.
analysis, working on the investment policies.
And that's why the first quarter reports, when we get variance reports, and really, unless you factor in all of these anomalies, really throws you off for the reasons that
Yeah,
we've just been
yeah.
discussing.
You see, Mr. Chairman, I guess my point was this, is that we're talking about 1.8 or 2, 1.8, and you're looking at a 25% working capital, which is 5.5, which is right in line with the 90 days. But in addition to that, you've got another $2.2 million, or another 10% of your budget, that is for a budget stabilization. And if you, depending on what name you applied to either one of these categories, they serve the same purpose. They serve the purpose of, one, making sure you've got your cash flow taken care of, and it serves the purpose of making sure that if you have under budgeted in an expenditure item, that you have the reserve to pay it back. And to me, from my perspective, it looks like we've got an extra 10% in this budget stabilization that is, in fact, in part of the working capital.
But see,
and
I
that's
would-
my only point.
And see, but again, I would come back to not necessarily agreeing with that. The working capital is about timing. The budget stabilization is a more permanent impact. If I come in exactly on my budget at the end of the year, exactly perfectly, I still need my working capital for cash flow in the first 3 months. If I come in $500,000 over budget, I still need my working capital for cash flow for the first 3 months, but now I need another $500,000 on top of it. So it may be too big. I mean, maybe the issue is the 10% is too much, but the working capital to me is the number that, regardless of what happens with the budget, that I need to get through my first 3 months, and the budget stabilization is by the way, I need that money to get through the first 3 months, and on top of it, I came in over budget $500,000. I need $500,000
But
more.
see, that was my point, Cindy, because you said the same thing. I need this to get through my first 3 months. And
Plus.
then the budget stabilization, I need it plus that.
Mm-hmm.
But my point is, there's a combination of those dollars that I think we need to take a look at. That's all. And I don't mean to beat
Yeah.
this to death, but
And I guess I don't think there is, only because I think it's a timing thing. But whether that's too much, that's a conversation. we can
That's
have.
the issue in terms of what the levels of them should be. Wants to determine the process. The process is how they clarifying the language you brought out, Glenn, and some of the issues that had been brought up in terms of the process. And then the final step is to begin to look at the values in each of those. And then, as mentioned, in implementing it through the year, you can have a budget amendment either way to either utilize it as for the process for each of those different components. So you do have that flexibility. It doesn't mean that once you set it at the beginning of the year, you put it on cruise control, because that's why it's there with these different elements that fold in. That's my point.
So you would have that once a year accounting where you have a CAFR. What I'm proposing is you don't try every quarter to figure out how much excess fund balance you have, that you take the CAFR and then you have an audited number for unassigned fund balance, and then you say, okay, I'm comparing that to this very specific number, which is current year revenues, budgeted expenditures and transfers. I'll make a determination how much is excess, and that's the number for this year. We can either use it now, save it till the summer, but that's the number. And that you have that benchmark each year of an audited number and an approved budgeted number. But kind of back to this a little bit. This is a big topic, and I appreciate all the conversation. I'd like to go away and think about some of the things that you shared with me today. Again, we probably in the first part of the year will have the conversation with council about some money for capital, like stormwater and things like that, and where to get it from. And obviously, this is the source. But I think it's worthwhile for us to take our time in deciding what recommendation we want to make in a resolution or an ordinance to council, and really think through the things we've talked about here today. I mean, the other thing that I would say, though, is that if I could at least get a feeling from you as a whole, and I've heard it from a couple of people, if we agree in principle on the idea of not using non-recurring revenue for recurring expenses, including debt service payments.
That's a given.
If we agree sort of generally that that it's appropriate to have an emergency expenditure set aside, as well as these other categories, and then maybe it's just a discussion about what the appropriate percentages of those categories are, and maybe just sort of the process for appropriating it. If we're pretty good with the broad, policy decisions inherent in this, then maybe we can move on to the numbers, next time that we talk about
The only
it.
thing I'm going to take exception to, Cindy, is the emergency disaster fund. I'm going to hit it hard. I just don't think we shouldn't go 4 years or 3 years rebuilding it. It should come out of our budget stabilization, so we know where we are. That's
Got that comment
that's the
down.
position I'll take as a board member.
Well, and I think that it's critical that at times there's an accusation or a claim that due diligence isn't provided, and we rush to judgment. And that's one of the things in this particular case, in this issue that we're dealing with, that we should take some time to digest, understand, have this dialogue as we go forward before the next time we will bring this up in the agenda, to have each of us get back to Cindy. Just think through what we've gone through today.
And call me individually. I would love that, so that we can have more
what
conversation
I'm
about this.
speaking to. Just to clarify some of the points, because I want to go through it with much more detail now that we've had all of these conversations. And so that, I don't know whether you want to have any more discussion, because my recommendation is to bring this up on the next meeting with more input that we would either gain in individual conversation only with Cindy and not with ourselves. And then...
Mr. Chairman, I agree with you. I think Cindy's done a good job in the first cut.
Yes.
I'd like to go back through it again. I have no problem at all. I've made my points a little bit. I think Cindy has heard them, and she'll try to think about them a little bit and see if they work.
And I agree with them. My wording may have not conveyed it, but I absolutely agree with you. The emergency one needs to go back first.
I'm sorry. Do you have a guideline or a timeline that you were given to bring this back to council?
Well, really, it's two things. One, it becomes something that I told council we would have in place before they start next year's budget process, in case the topic of using fund balance to balance the budget comes up again. More importantly, we also have some pressures on infrastructure spending, particularly stormwater, that are coming to the forefront in the next few months. So it would really be nice, I guess, if at least it was clear that the Finance Commission agreed on the principles inherent in this, and maybe not just the numbers just yet. That might be helpful.
When would it be good for you to have that information?
January, February.
Okay, all right.
Gonna-
I wanted to make sure we just weren't putting you in an awkward position.
Yeah, no.
But I would like to do that. I'd like to come back and have another opportunity to talk about.
And certainly if amending the budget to use some of the fund balance that got created in 14-15 for capital comes up, we've had this conversation. I mean, so I think I could accurately report that, pending the policy, there was at least some general agreement about the inherent.
And part of my concern was about the emergency fund. It might be wise to at least think about putting that in as a line item in the budget and look at, because you won't use it every year, so it'll just be something else. And then maybe even looking at, would you need to increase that if costs go up? Something along those lines. So I would appreciate the opportunity to come back and talk about it some more.
From a GASB standpoint, it's how do I put this? It's easier with my auditors to get it set aside. If I call it committed fund balance, then I'm able to put it into the CAFR as a committed line, as a committed number.
Okay, and
if
that's
it's
good
not established as committed.
That's good information.
And that was the rationale for doing it that way, because it'll always show as that $2 million, and the auditors will have to let us show it that way.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you, Cindy.
And it's probably helpful to some of the bond rating agencies as well. A, with a policy, and B, with a level. So,
At the risk of drowning you all, if you want, there's a lot of great analysis out there of fund balances. This is a great case study that someone in Colorado Springs did, and it's huge, but it's worth reading. The problem that I have is that a lot of these, they take, it's the measure it with a micrometer, cut it with an axe thing. You take this giant spreadsheet and you put in this 0.2 and factors, but all the multipliers are all completely subjective anyway. So you're kind of just as well off going 3 months is 25%, 10% seems about right. But there are really some excellent points to be made in here, and they share a lot, believe it or not, in common with us in terms of their risks related to weather events like fires and blizzards, in aging infrastructure, in pension challenges and things like that. And this is really good. So I didn't print it because I didn't want to kill that many trees, but I'll have the link to this article sent to you through Sherry, and this is a really good thing to read.
yeah, and they actually have had 2 follow-ups on that from the original study in Colorado Springs. But one of the points being made that Cindy keeps bringing up is the risk factor. If you're talking about a city of 250,000 as opposed to a city of 15,000, that is one of the leverages that has to be taken. Why, as Cindy mentioned, if you're talking some of these percentages, they can be very, very low, but do not apply to us because of the order of magnitude if some of these things hit. So
you say we have less risk? Vero Beach has less
I'm saying a lot more risk because we're smaller. So therefore, you have any base case is
can't
going
spread
to
it
hit
across
us.
a big base.
A small.
25% of $200 million is, or 17% of $200 million is quite a bit more impressive a number than $3 million. Again, that's my point of, you can take that 17%, multiply it by our budget, and you've got $3 million to cover everything. And I would have to tell you, I think that is woefully inadequate. That would be scary to look at our fund balance and see $3 million.
I read in here where you, on your last page, you say if Vero's reserves were at the minimum 17% recommended by GFOA. Okay, is that in a different publication? Because I'm not seeing
there's a
in here where they say 17% is the recommended level or minimum level. I missed it if it's in here.
I think it's either the first or the second one, determined appropriate level. They had that number in the old one. They might have taken it out of the new one.
Well, anyway, we're quite a bit above 17%.
And my point being 17% is you might see that number somewhere, but it's kind of scary in terms of the dollar amount that it creates. So, at least in my mind.
Well, yeah, and they talked about a forest fire as an emergency in Colorado Springs, but if a hurricane hits Vero Beach, it affects every one of our residents in our facilities as opposed to a location that is hundreds of square miles. I don't want to beat up on it. I'm sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. I commend you. This has really been a good discussion. There's no question about that, and I think you're hitting all the right points and very thoroughly. One thing I just bring up, just not because I have an opinion to do it or anything like that, but I think it ought to be brought up, and that is I wonder if having a line of credit instead of cash somewhere might be an alternative.
What's that, Randy?
Having a line of credit for something instead of a cash balance would be an alternative. That's all.
Well, I understood that we had the mechanism in place to have a line of credit if we needed it. But as far as just going in, was that not true, Cindy? Or?
I think some cash management people would say, why have $2 million in cash and $2 million in debt to support it when you could just have a line of credit instead of the $2 million and not have the debt? And so I'm just throwing it out there. I'm not saying, hey, look, let's do that. But I think it's something that ought to be discussed and said, no, that is not what we want to do, or yes, that's a great idea.
Okay, we don't actually have any debt to support our cash right now. So the question really becomes, would we rather have a line of credit than actually have cash available?
Right.
In other words, it would entail borrowing that we don't currently do.
In order to answer the question, you may have to ask another question. What would you do with a $90 million reserve?
Well,
You wouldn't eliminate it entirely, but the question. I've been asked this question. How about we just borrow money if we have a hurricane?
How low would you take it?
Yeah. I'm just putting it out there. I'm not saying that's where you are.
It's a good thought question.
But I think it's again, Randy. I think it's one thing to borrow for capital assets, and I would not be opposed to that. But when we start borrowing money for operating expenses, that worries me quick, right?
Yeah, and well, the point again in that analysis that Cindy has recommended. Part of it is a discussion of a secondary and tertiary response in terms of what Randy just talked about, just having the ability to do it as opposed to actually borrowing it unless you get into a hellacious situation. But again, that's just part of this emerging discussion that we're having. And I'm glad you brought it up. Thank you, Randy.
When interest rates get to 8%, Randy, we're going to figure out something different.
And frankly, to be honest with you, $2 million for emergency expenditures, that isn't very much money.
No.
If we ever had a real, Cat 5 hurricane impact, $2 million won't even get you started.
Yeah.
So that would be the case where maybe we need to consider having a line of credit in place as a backstop against a very small emergency expenditure reserve. We spent $6-8 million in the first 3 weeks after that one, and that wasn't a Hurricane Andrew landing on your shores.
Right.
So I mean, certainly having a line of credit in the mix is something that needs to maybe be discussed in the context of.
But Cindy, did I misunderstand? Sometime way back, we had talked about budget shortfalls, and I thought I understood you to say we have the mechanism in place if we needed to do a line of credit.
I think I said we don't, that we used to, but we don't right now. I mean, if we wanted to, we could probably go get one, but we do not have a line of credit in place right now. I don't ever recall saying that we did.
But there's no prohibition about getting it.
There's no prohibition, but we'd have to go out and do the RFP.
Yeah, we had a discussion, Chairman, at some point about the budget if there was a budget shortfall, et cetera, and maybe my recollection is not exactly correct.
I will tell you, we do business with Wells Fargo. I think if we needed to borrow $2 million tomorrow, that's not going to be an issue. I mean, they're pretty well, assuming that we have money in the bank. I mean, if we run everything down to zero, you may have to go out and pay for a line of credit. But I think, practically speaking, if the hurricane came through here and we were getting down to the basics where we needed to borrow money for something,
we could get it.
Yeah, we could get it. I mean, we spent a lot of money with Wells Fargo.
With that Wells Fargo option, then we could apply this idea to the working capital portion of this. Maybe $2 million in hurricane or emergency expenses is too low, but if we ever became short of paying bills, you could use that option of a debt.
But you need to keep a cushion that we don't go to the bank. Yeah, I mean, and I think
$5 million. Was that?
Well, the key is you borrow the money, and let's say it's for working capital, then you're paying reoccurring costs, and you borrow the money for reoccurring cost at that point.
That's a disaster.
Yeah. I mean, again, I guess I find, again, being conservative like I am, I find it a little disconcerting to talk about doing away with money that we have on hand that we've had. Our fund balance 5 or 6 years ago was $9 million. It's gone up and down a little bit, but it hasn't grown that much in the last decade. And taking and doing away for I'm not sure what with money that we currently have on hand and then borrowing money money to cover things like cash flow. It seems to me like, again, I'm just very conservative, I'm not sure why we would do that, and unless we had a very compelling reason why we would run ourselves down. Again, it's not a recurring revenue source. It's not the solution for operating expenditures for the next 2 decades. And so why we would start to take that very conservative, fairly, comfortable approach and grind it down to borrowing money for cash flow and borrowing money for hurricanes. I'm not sure why we're headed in that direction.
And,
but
well,
it's a little
years ago, and I'll just stop right there. I won't say how many years ago, but when the interest rates were better, municipality, I don't know about municipalities, county governments and school systems had an opportunity to be able to borrow money at 1/2 of prime and invest it at prime. That got us over that cash flow hump because you had to prove your cash deficit, 6 weeks or 12-week cash deficit. And once you got over that and showed the cash deficit, then you made sufficient money to pay back your loan plus relieve the taxpayers from a little bit of tax increase. So,
we don't have that arbitrage right
those
now.
days are gone. So
in the good
anyway,
old
thank
days,
you.
right?
I'll wait until December with the Fed.
Am I that old?
Go ahead.
Before we make it, I'd like to raise a couple of questions. Old business.
Absolutely. Mr. Chairman, I've got to leave. I've got an appointment. I'm sorry.
I just have a couple of questions on old business, and while I got
We have a quorum.
Jim and
Yeah, we only have
elected officials here, I'd like to raise the questions. The question is this, and I'm asking elected officials. The city got an offer from Florida Power and Light for the sale of the shores. And the counter to back of that was never brought to the Finance Committee and asked them a damn thing about it. And excuse my language. But that's the first thing. And you say, wait a minute. Was there a reason we weren't brought into that? And was it a good, viable reason? And are we supposed to be representing the city taxpayers and the ratepayers and helping? And yet we were dismissed as if we're Boy Scouts. Okay, that's one. Two, City Council has approved this tax tip program for downtown. It affects a huge amount of the city. We got a very small city, and we just approved this tip deal, I guess, and I don't know how it affects the city. I have no idea. And nobody's made an analysis that I can see. We haven't seen it. Mr. Chairman, have you seen it? Nope.
I'm sorry, are we talking about the economic development zone?
Yeah. I mean, what's the economic impact of that?
Actually, that ordinance was put in place, almost 3 years ago?
A couple years back, but it failed. Remember, then it came back.
Well,
so what's the impact of that?
I did an analysis. I'd be happy to share it with you. But at the time when it was done, like 3 years ago.
None of us have seen it, and none of us have seen. Now, I have read how we got to the counteroffer, but I think it's sort of dismissive of people that spent a lot of time not to have at least had the courtesy to bring it to them. It sometimes feels like we're being used to help and give cover for some of our elected officials, and then when they don't want our input, they dismissively move on. Now, I hope that's not the feeling I'm getting, but I'm speaking my mind about it.
And Glenn, I appreciate that. I don't think there's any effort for you to cover anybody, the administration or elected officials or anything else. The issue on the downtown economic, and as Cindy said, she did an analysis of that, and would be very happy that that information will be available to you. But in that particular case, the only thing you're saying is that you're taking an increase in ad valorem taxes collected in a general area.
I understand.
But we can bring that to you. On the response, we'd have to bring Chef in and our and his consultant to show you where we arrived at Indian River Shores. But I think there was a timing issue there that we didn't have time to go through all of the processes in order to get a response back to Indian River Shores. The $13 million that was presented to us was sort of out of the blue. Nobody really anticipated that. We arrived on our doorstep one day, we took it, and we felt like that we had to get a response back in a reasonable period of time. So,
Jim, I understand that, but the reality is, when you're out in the public, and like some of this crew is too, they're asking questions. Now, how in the world did we get to that? And if we're going to have committees like this, then we need to use them responsibly. If it means 30 days later, then it means 30 days later. Now, as you know, I speak pretty bluntly too, and I just think that I don't think it's helpful for us to use committees when we need them and not use them when we don't want them. And if it takes 30 days longer, then it's going to take 30 days longer.
Then we could do that. And again, if you want Chef to come back in here, we could, have him come in and make.
I don't want to force the cost on any of the city any more than we have. I just think that I'm not sure, Jim, that had that counteroffer been brought back to this committee, that it would have gone back out the same way. But I don't know, because we never got the opportunity to look at it.
Didn't we cover that in the joint meeting, the utility and finance?
Not the counter.
I
think it was explained after the fact.
Maybe after the fact, but I don't know.
But it was
weren't
explained because I think that both Chef and Bill were both here at that joint meeting.
Yeah, I don't think it was any. There's no way we're trying to go around you or anything like that. I mean,
I just want to be blunt about it. I think if we're going to,
I don't blame you for being blunt, but there's no way we're trying to go around you at all by any means. No.
Well,
no, it really don't.
Well, you guys are really getting the hard questions. For example, the reserve fund balance issue is a very political issue, and I mean it's one that and both of those that you talked about were maybe minimized on the Main Street, but the other one was, and so I mean you guys are getting some pretty hard issues, but I think
I want us to be involved. Don't get me wrong. I'm going to try to dodge the issues,
right?
But I want us to be involved in the big issues if there are. And I just think if we're going to be involved in them, I want to be involved in them all. I don't want to be slighted just because
cherry picked for items. But and I think Randy is right. But obviously, it was after the number would have been calculated, and submitted.
Yeah.
Well, but the work that we've done, whether it's an OPEB, whether it's on the pension, what we've done. How we've been working with the staff to put together some of these checks and balances, this particular issue, what we've done in insurance. There's been a lot that over the last couple of years.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not arguing that. I agree with that. But we are, a lot of us out in public, and they say, no, I'll get hit. How the hell did we get to 65 million?
Well, yeah, the particularly when we have a election every year, and there's so much information that takes a life of its own, it becomes very difficult to be responsive. I mean, try to go to Publix and not have someone come up and
And a lot of things we do.
I appreciate you bringing it up, and I think you've made our sensitivity aware of those type of concerns and to make sure that it gets back. And we have really tried to involve this committee as well as the Utility Commission in the discussions all about the electric, and that was an oversight because you're right, the number was developed, but I thought we did report it, but we'll get that back.
Well, again, I understand some of the problems are the sunshine law. You can't discuss sometimes, negotiating tactics with another city. That's hard to do in the public. It really is. I mean, without blowing everything.
Well, we tried the mediation in public. You saw with that.
Yeah, I clearly understand. Sunshine law does cause a lot of problems. No doubt about it. And I guess, Jim, coming back to that question, on the sunshine law, the city council can have an executive meeting. Right.
Well, if it's involving litigation and the threat of litigation.
But can committees have executive sessions?
I don't know.
Legality of
I don't think you guys have something that would be threatening litigation on a committee.
So it's a litigation question.
Litigation and labor
law. Is it? It's only the litigation issue.
Well, it's only personnel as it applies to union contracts. It's not personnel as it applies to, council firing me or something.
that clarifies some of it, you know. I
Yeah,
know
it's a
sunshine
very, very narrow window, and you
Yeah.
guys would not fall into that. The one thing we did uncover in that exercise that we just went through, our errors and emissions insurance does cover you all making decisions relative to your capacity on the Finance Commission or Utility Commission, because that came up and
Yeah.
when it was had to sign that
confidentiality agreement.
confidentiality thing. So
Right.
So just to make sure that we do, the city does carry a policy for you.
Yeah, it did come up. Some people have said, I don't want to be on city council. I don't want to be in a committee for that reason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just have a motion then to go forward and schedule at a future date another session on the follow-up?
Also move.
Second.
Second. Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Cindy, how do you want to proceed? It's 7 minutes of 5, and you have your last report on the upgrade of technology and the process improvements. And it was over an hour discussion, I believe, when I was with at the Utilities Commission.
It was, and Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence, I think the white paper kind of stands for itself, and we've covered a lot of ground in the last 3 hours. If you don't mind, I'm certainly happy to leave that white paper as it stands, and anyone's welcome to call me and discuss the particulars with me. I don't think we want to do that for another hour, but it's up to you.
Mr. Chairman, I think that would be appropriate given the extended time of this meeting, and just bring it up, put it on the agenda item for the next meeting.
Put it on for the next meeting. In the meantime, if you want to talk about what we're doing, just feel free to give me a call. We're moving on as outlined in the paper for right now.
And that won't require any additional work because it's already here.
Yeah,
Well,
and again, Cindy has done a superb job. This is something we've been talking about now. And so much of it was all of the IT couldn't be done because you didn't know whether you were going to have 34,000 customers or 15,000 customers, whatever. So the bottom line is there's a number of detailed decisions to be made in terms that the level and continuation of platinum customer service, opened 5 or 6 different ways to pay, without going into the details. I recommend reading it, get in touch with Cindy, and then we'll bring it back. And
In the meantime, the Utility Commission did vote unanimously to recommend that we do proceed with the e-box and the lockbox option as outlined in the memo, but we won't be having a team meeting to start that until January, so we have time to meet with you as well.
Great.
So,
Good.
yeah, we're not going to do that before that.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion for adjournment.
do I have a second?
You will in just a moment, Mr. Chairman. I'll second it for discussion. Before we do adjourn, I want to thank Jim and Cindy again, because, Cindy, you go through a great deal of detail, and you respond to the questions, and I appreciate that very much. And so thank you from my seat.
Thank you very much.
And I second that, Mr. Chairman.
Right. All in favor?
All right.
Nathan, I hope we haven't discouraged you with our discussion. Another good reason to adjourn.
You saw him going like this?